male scent invading her nostrils and threatening to steal away all thought and reason. "On the contrary," he said, his lips skating over the delicate curve of her ear and making butterflies take flight in her chest. "I believe our engagement ball was last night." His hands stayed where they were, gripping the edge of the desk. She turned away from his mouth and glanced at them. His knuckles were white from holding the desk so tightly. "That does not make this right," she said. "Tell me you don't want me to touch you again." She straightened her head, and his mouth was at her ear once more, teasing her with its warmth. "Tell me you find me repulsive." Oddly enough, it didn't sound like an arrogant challenge. It was almost as if he did want her to tell him those things. She stole another glance down at his hand at her side. It continued to grip the desk like it was his lifeline. "Tell me, Briannon," he whispered. "Tell me to leave, and I will." She turned her face up to his, and for the first time saw the crusade he was waging inside of himself. He did want her to tell him to leave. It would be the sane thing to do, the wise thing. All she had to do was open her mouth and repeat his command. Leave. One word. That was all it would take. He would sweep out of her study and back to Hadley Gardens, and she would be safe from ruination. She would be safe from him. She closed her eyes in sublime rapture, her voice a tortured whisper. "I don't want you to leave." A low groan built in the bottom of his throat. The tension blossomed between them, raw and powerful, and incredibly fragile. It held Brynn captive. "Then say yes," he said. "Tell me I may touch you." Brynn arched toward him in a semi-trance, her eyes sweeping open. She swallowed hard, and her mouth shaped the words he was begging her to say. "Yes, touch me." The words were wanton and vulgar, and yet she could not feel ashamed of them. They were honest. She wanted his hands on her again. She'd wanted it every moment of this last week. And right now she could hardly say no, not with him looking at her the way he was, plying her with his heavy-lidded eyes and his tantalizingly close body. Brynn was acutely aware of how attractive he was. The smooth wings of his eyebrows, the sensual curve of his mouth, the sharp planes of his cheekbones. His eyes glittered with restrained passion. She licked suddenly dry lips. The desk shook as he continued to grasp it. "Where? Tell me where to touch you." She blushed at his bidding. To know where she wanted his hands was one thing, but to tell him where he could put them? She couldn't do it. "I don't know," she managed to say. He lowered his mouth to hers, but continued to speak, his lips brushing against hers in feather-light nudges. "If you cannot be more specific, I have my own ideas in mind." Finally his hands came off the desk, but they still did not caress her, at least not her body. His fingers trailed down the linen of her dress, bunching the fabric so that the hem was starting to rise above her ankles, then her calves, then her knees. Brynn gasped as his hot fingers slipped underneath her skirt and skimmed her thigh. She wore a pair of thin cotton drawers, but she could still feel the heat of his palm as it rounded to the back of her thigh, and hiked her leg up so that her foot left the floor. She gasped, shock and desire filling her in frantic beats. Desire won out as Archer stepped closer, tucking himself flush against her body. He brought her raised leg around his hip and hinged it there, her skirt tossed up around her knee. She felt him, all of him, and it stole away any shred of decency she had left. He stared boldly into her eyes, daring her to look away or to blush at the bulging ridge of his desire pressing so intimately into the soft, yielding parts of her. But Brynn held his gaze, her breath coming in small, shallow huffs, her body feeling as if it were melting at the point where their bodies intersected. God help her. She wanted more. A hint of a smile curved his perfect lips, so close to hers. All Brynn had to do was move forward an inch in order to claim them. So she did. Her bold but tentative kiss surprised him. She felt the squeeze of his hand on her thigh in response, and then heard another low groan in his throat, felt it reverberate through her. His tongue pushed past her closed lips with less tenderness this time. He stroked inside, while his hand... Brynn inhaled sharply when she realized where his hand, buried under her skirts, was travelling. His fingers reached the waistband of her drawers and tugged, pulling the undergarment lower around her hips. "Archer," she gasped. "I told you I had my own ideas," he replied, before capturing her lips again. His flattened hand scooped underneath the waistband of her drawers and slid along her bare skin, curving around her buttock until he had it firmly in his palm. He kneaded her flesh, his fingertips stroking lower and inward, closer to the heart of her. Brynn could not bring herself to twist away from his mouth in order to stop him. She was lost to the trembling sensations pulsing in the pit of her stomach. His lips were on hers, plying her with slow, sensual kisses, and with every push and pull of their mouths and tongues, the further away the rest of the room, the rest of the house and world became. It was only she and Archer, his hands and mouth possessing her utterly, but as his hand swept over the top of her thigh and tugged her drawers a little lower, she stiffened. She parted her lashes to see if the door remained shut, a small voice in her head begging her to see reason and sense. The door wasn't locked. Anyone could walk in. "No one is there, Brynn. You are safe." Archer had pulled from their kiss long enough to counsel her, and now returned to her mouth, his teeth gently nipping her lower lip. She sighed into the kiss, her tongue touching his and retreating shyly. Archer coaxed it back as his fingers brushed lower. "Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you," he whispered, as his hand finally settled over the most private part of her. She caught her breath, her body again turning rigid at the shocking contact of his palm. "I don't think I—" One of his strong fingers slipped between her legs, dipping into her most secret place. The rest of Brynn's sentence dissolved into a hushed moan. She froze against him, clamping her legs together, a pulsing sensation streaking through her. "Don't, darling." His lips moved against hers as he spoke. "Trust me, Brynn." She nodded as he caressed her, parting her thighs, his palm brushing past the soft thatch of curls. Archer drew his finger along her sensitive flesh, the feathery stroking making her giddy with longing. "I'll stop if you ask," he murmured against her. "But tell me you want my touch, and I promise you will feel nothing but pleasure." Brynn knew he was telling the truth. He would stop if she insisted he do so. But his promise felt too divine, too glorious to deny. And his words, the sound of his whispered voice, his breath hot in her ear, made her more inflamed than his hands did. Filled with unfathomable yearnings, Brynn parted her lips. "Yes, yes." With a groan of relief, Archer slid his finger deeply into her. Brynn gasped at the sudden pressure, her eyes going wide. His finger stroked and teased, filling her for a moment, but then drew out. She had just gathered a breath when he sank into her again. Her pulse hitched at the gathering tension between her thighs, a stunned moan escaping her lips. "You consume my thoughts," he whispered in her ear, his teeth taking the lobe and tugging it gently. "Day and night." He nipped across her jawline to find her mouth, sucking her lower lip in between his. He flicked it lazily with the tip of his tongue, while his thumb skillfully teased the delicate bud at the apex of her thighs, building a hot, swollen pressure inside of her. As he stroked into her again, a second finger joined the first, and she arched her back, straining to get closer to him. The sensations coming to life between her legs and rippling through her body were so maddening that she cried out with the sinful pleasure of it. "What have you done to me?" she whispered. "Archer, I can't—" "Soon, sweet." His mouth took hers in a ravenous kiss. His tongue mimicked the sensuous slide of his fingers, driving her into a near frenzy. With shameless greed, Brynn closed her eyes and instinctively thrust her hips against his hand. She almost sobbed at the relentless urgency of his fingers as liquid fire raced unheeded along her limbs, building and building. "I've wanted to touch you like this since that night on the lane to Worthington Abbey," he said, his expert strokes bringing her higher on that swell of hot pleasure. It threatened to incinerate her. "You were so beautiful in the moonlight, so fearless. Had we been alone, I would have taken you then." Had her head not been thrown back in pure ecstasy, her ability to speak utterly lost, she would have told him how she had felt the attraction too, and how every night since she had drifted to sleep with shamefully erotic dreams of him. Dreams just like this reality. Only she had never imagined it could feel this sensual and frustrating at the same time. It wasn't just her body reaching for him, wanting more of his touch. It felt like her soul was craving him as well, pleasured with one breath, unfulfilled with the next. Archer's fingers quickened, teasing and toying. His thumb rubbed the little nub at her entrance until her body strained against him. "Please," she begged, not knowing in the least what she was pleading for. "You're intoxicating." He nipped her bottom lip with his teeth before laving it with his tongue. "I want to drink you, Brynn, consume you. I want to taste every warm, wet part of your body." Brynn moaned at the picture he'd just painted. Every part of her body? Did men do such things? He smiled as if knowing her thoughts. "You're imagining how it will feel when I take you with my mouth instead of my hand," he whispered. You're... was all Brynn could gasp, with the sweet burden inside her swelling high and hot. "Yes, like this," he murmured before driving his tongue inside her mouth. He curled it around hers, tugging and stroking, promising her something she had never before fathomed. Brynn could no longer breathe, and surprisingly, she found she didn't need air, just his sliding tongue and plunging fingers, and with Archer's rapid breathing hot in her throat, pleasure broke through her. She cried out at the shockwaves of bliss, and then whimpered as she rode Archer's hand shamelessly, thrusting to claim the last ebbs of satisfaction. As they flattened out inside of her, she exhaled. She felt as if her body had splintered into 1,000 hot fragments that were now slowly piecing themselves back together. She'd never experienced anything so shattering in her life. Archer kissed her softly, removing his hand from the damp crux of her body and pulling her drawers back into place. Her leg, rid of all muscle and strength, fell from his hip, and Archer smiled knowingly as he straightened her skirts. She breathed heavily, though for once, being breathless felt absolutely divine. "I cannot believe I allowed you to do that," she whispered after a long moment. Archer parted his lips to reply, his raffish grin promising a witty and lewd reply, but a knock on the study's door smothered his grin and sent him whipping around and away from the desk. Brynn pushed off the desk and lunged toward one wall of bookshelves, a trembling hand reaching to her hair to smooth whatever damage had been done to it. "Enter," she said in a voice far more composed than she felt. Braxton cracked the study door to find Archer near the hearth and Brynn at the shelves. If he sensed anything amiss, his emotionless face did not betray it. "Lord Northridge has returned, my lady, if his grace still wishes for an audience." Archer turned from the hearth, his shoulders squared, his back straight as an arrow. "Thank you, but I have other business to attend to. I will see Lord Northridge at another time." Braxton bowed and retreated, though Brynn noticed he did not close the door all the way. She let out a shaky breath, watching as Archer strode slowly across the room. At the door he paused and turned to face her. His sultry stare was gone, but she was glad to see his more familiar, cold and distant expression had not replaced it. Instead, Archer looked at her with a kind of searching wonder, the same way he had the night before when she had arrived in the ballroom. "I must leave," he said, the abrupt words not matching the deeply possessive glint in those storm-swept eyes. "Of course." What else could she say? She could still hardly breathe from the last few minutes of relentless pleasure his hands and whispered seductions had brought her. After another awkward pause, Archer lowered himself into the deepest bow she had yet seen him make, and took his leave. Exhaling slowly, Brynn stood at the bookshelves, her legs still weak and her core still throbbing from his ministrations. Sanity and reason came back in a slow, inexorable rush. Hot shame was swift to follow. Good God, what had she done? Chapter 20. "Hawke," Stephen Kensington, the Earl of Thorndale, said with a lazy smile. At least leave some of our money on the table if you're not in the game. That's the 9th hand you've won, yet you are 1,000 miles away." Archer drew the pile of chips from the middle of the gaming table toward the already significant stack lying in front of him. Despite his social elevation to the Duke of Bradburn, the nickname among those who knew him had stuck. Thorndale was one of the few men he tolerated, liked even, amongst his peers. He had always struck him as a fastidious but generous man. Archer knew for a fact that he had donated a large part of his own fortune to build a new wing for a struggling hospital on the outskirts of London, an act largely due to his new wife, whose father was a local physician. Thorndale was one of the few not targeted by the true Masked Marauder. Archer collected his cards for the next round, checking the single one lying face down beneath the king in front of him. An ace, a natural. He pushed a handful of chips toward the large pile as the others did the same. "Lady Luck is with me tonight, it seems." "Luck of the devil, you mean?" Marcus Bainley muttered sourly. Archer shot the young man a level look, but did not respond. Of the 5 other men at the card table, Bainley was the youngest. The son and heir of the aging Marquess of Bromley, he was a society dandy with a reputation for gambling, profligacy, and gossip. With a massive fortune at his disposal, he cared nothing for expense, and flaunted his money with the delicacy of an elephant in a tea-room, which was why he'd been the Masked Marauder's first victim. Archer couldn't fathom how Bainley was such a favourite within the upper crust of London society. He made a mental note to divest the fop of more of his coin at a future date. The other 3 men he knew only by association. Helmford Monty was a handsome Italian ambassador with a penchant for whiskey and women. He and Archer's father had had a lot in common. The Duke of Basford was an elderly man who spent so much time at the tables that he was rumoured to have his own suite of rooms in the upper-level apartments of the club, despite having several properties in London and multiple sprawling country estates. His 5th wife was younger than his oldest son and heir. Unbeknownst to him, Archer had stripped the lecherous old bastard of a significant sum in Cheshire the previous autumn, during hunting season. The last player, Viktor Zakharov, was a man Archer had never met before, but had disliked from the start. Thorndale had introduced him as some important Russian diplomat. Something about the man seemed slippery. His austere face hid secrets, and Archer had enough experience with those to know that Viktor Zakharov was not who he seemed. Archer didn't mind taking his money, however. He had never been fond of gambling, but tonight he had made an exception. White's, the exclusive gentlemen's gaming club to which he had belonged since his days at Cambridge, was crowded, and Archer was grateful for that fact. He glanced around at the sumptuous decor. Sparkling chandeliers, plush deep blue velvet carpets, and rich mahogany furniture surrounded by priceless paintings gave off a feel of unsurpassed luxury. For many men of the ton, it was a well-cherished home away from home. They ate and drank their fill in the supper rooms and moved on to play a relaxed hand of 21 or bet entire fortunes on a roll of the dice in the game rooms until the wee hours of the morning. Though the club was designed exclusively for males, there was no shortage of female company should such diversions be required. The soft hum of voices and the constant sweep of cards kept Archer's innermost thoughts at bay. He wanted nothing more than to be distracted by anything other than the 3 things plaguing him: his father's killer, exposing the impersonator, and deflowering the lovely Lady Briannon, the last of which kept him in an uncomfortable state of perpetual arousal. Normally Archer would find a suitable companion with whom he'd engage in a meaningless dalliance, but he knew that only one woman would sate the raw ache within him. Her natural, artless sensuality drove him to distraction. Earlier that morning in her study, Brynn had opened to him, trusting him as she had never trusted any other. Despite the sweet torment of his own unfulfilled desire, he would gladly repeat the act endless times, just to savour the delighted surprise in her eyes as her body found its release. Archer knew they were flirting with disaster. They weren't truly engaged, and to continue on as if they were was simply inviting destruction upon both their heads. But he couldn't help himself when he was around her. He became a besotted fool. He also knew that he was being selfish. Archer had every intention of breaking the engagement once the Duke's killer, and the man impersonating the bandit, was found. They were one and the same. Archer was certain of it. The handwriting on all three of the notes was unmistakably the same. When he found the killer, he would find the impersonator as well, and then Archer would set the marauder's reputation to rights. Brynn may now know the truth of the crimes he'd committed, and to what purpose, but she would not stand aside and be complicit while he continued his mission, the single-minded duty that had driven and satisfied him for years. But for the first time Archer could remember, he desired something for himself, something far more satisfying than the gratification of repurposing the Ton's wealth. He wanted Briannon Findlay. But where would that leave her? If he did what he truly wanted to do, she would be ruined for any other man. A surge of wild jealousy ripped through him at the thought of Brynn's naked body wrapped in the arms of anyone else. He shoved the unexpected emotion away with a low growl. He had never let a woman get under his skin the way she had, and it wasn't just about losing himself in her. Archer enjoyed their verbal sparring. He liked hearing her real thoughts as they flew, unedited from her tongue. He liked seeing her upon a horse and watching her across a dinner table. He especially liked knowing she belonged to him. "She doesn't," he muttered to himself. She was not his, not truly. "She doesn't what?" Thorndale said, with an elegantly raised eyebrow. "Something on your mind, Hawk? A special someone, perhaps? Care to elaborate?" "No, I do not." He frowned fiercely and signalled to a hovering server to refill his drink, ignoring the knowing smile on Thorndale's face. "Don't worry, my friend," he said, toasting him. "This is the easy part. Wait until the wedding nears. The insanity has only just begun. Have you set a date yet?" "No," he snapped. "His Grace is to be married?" Victor asked, his thick accent distorting his words. Thorndale tucked a cheroot between his lips and lit it, clearly enjoying Archer's plight. "It was announced only this week, and to the lovely Lady Briannon Findlay, no less." His eyes brightened. "Speaking of, here is the lady's brother himself. Northridge, wonderful to see you, old chap," Thorndale said, and gestured to the last open seat at their table. "I see you are back for another sound whipping." At Archer's raised eyebrow, Thorndale grinned wolfishly. "Northridge made the mistake of coming here before your engagement ball last night. I doubt he will remember much of it, other than leaving with sadly empty pockets." Archer looked up and nodded a curt greeting to Brynn's brother. He hadn't quite forgiven the young man's foolish outburst the night past, but what was done was done. Northridge looked wan and worse for wear, although he still cut an impeccable figure in his dapper evening clothes. His grin was sheepish. "Thank you for the offer, but I think I'll favour the dice tables tonight." Perhaps it was Northridge's arrival, or the fact that seeing him made him think of his sister, but Archer lost the next hand, and the next four after that. He was just about to throw it in and take his leave when he realized Bainley had asked him a question. "Rumours abounded that you would never marry, Bradburn. Why the change of heart, or is it your change of fortune?" Bradburn. No one had called him by his father's title until now, and it hung like a pall in the air. His name had always been Hawksfield, and hearing his father's name applied to him now, alongside the young man's sly baiting question, made him thirst for a fight. Archer did not respond in the way Bainley expected. Calling him out would only draw more attention to himself, and after the unfortunate article in the Times, he didn't need any more of that. He lounged back in his chair and tossed a few more chips onto the pile in the centre. "Why, the love of a good woman could induce the devil himself to court a lady." "So it's love, then?" "I don't know," Archer said smoothly. "Is that what the rumours are saying?" The men at the table broke out in laughter, and Bainley turned red. Archer hadn't insulted him by calling him a gossip to his face, but the underlying insult was there just the same. Bainley stood, darting a seething look in Archer's direction, collected his remaining chips, and left without a word. Thorndale won the next hand, and smiled in satisfaction. "It's about time." "Hawk," a man's voice said. "May I join you?" Archer looked around to see Brant standing there. His long-time friend was immaculately dressed in a moss-green coat with gold buttons and grey pantaloons. It had been a game of theirs early on to pass Brant off as a gentleman in the ton, inventing outlandish double identities for him, particularly during the season, but they hadn't done it for some time. It had amused them to no end that no one ever recognized Brant. The privileged had a way of behaving as if their servants were invisible. Archer nodded to the proprietor of the establishment, who had escorted Brant to their table, vouching for the newcomer's arrival. Though Brant was not a member, Archer knew the owner would not risk alienating the new Duke of Bradburn. Archer hid his surprise. Perhaps Brant had simply wanted a change of scene. "Mr. Broxton," he said casually, "when did you get back into town?" "Just today." Brant's bored response could rival any English peacock's. "Sorry I missed your engagement ball. I heard it was the crush of the season." Brant endured the other men's curious stares. An invitation to Hawke's engagement would only mean that he was a close friend of the Duke's. Archer nodded for him to take Bainley's vacant seat. Brant placed a stack of chips on the green felt of the table as Archer introduced him to the other players. "Mr. Broxton is a friend of mine from Essex. He is in the export business and manages some of my international investments. He travels frequently, so he is not often in town." Brant settled in like a natural, and play resumed for another hour, with Thorndale and Brant taking most of the hands. Archer was forced to concede that his luck had run out, or perhaps he wasn't focused enough. Brant's arrival had made him more inclined to stay, but he was considering asking his friend to retire with him to Hadley Gardens and take on the better part of a bottle of aged brandy, when a whispered comment at the table beside them stopped him cold. Dowager Viscountess Hamilton was attacked. He turned and saw Lord Everton holding the men at his table transfixed with the news. "She was attacked?" Archer interrupted. "Where?" The young lord was eager to share the gossip. "In her home, by the Masked Marauder, last night. She was beaten severely." Archer frowned, exchanging a swift glance with Brant. Viscountess Hamilton had pleaded illness and had not been at the engagement ball. "What kind of animal would attack an old lady?" Thorndale said, disgust coating his words. "How is she?" Archer said. "Recovering, but Dr. Hargrove says that she is lucky to be alive. My mother is the Viscountess's cousin." "The scoundrel has to be stopped," Basford growled. "He attacked my carriage several months ago. No one was hurt, thank goodness, but it appears he is becoming more vicious in his attacks. Lady Hamilton is ancient." No one remarked that she and the late Duke were the same age, but the news certainly dampened the previously jovial atmosphere in the club. Cards lay forgotten on the tables as conversation grew agitated, with everyone weighing in on the identity of the bandit, his burgeoning list of crimes, and his newfound passion for violence. Archer felt sick to his stomach. "Any more news on the Duke's killer, Hawke?" Thorndale asked. "Do they think it's this masked bandit?" Archer shook his head. "Bow Street has their suspects, including him." "But no leads?" Monty asked, watching him with interested black eyes. For a moment, something in the man's tone bothered Archer, and he wondered whether Monty or someone else here could be the impostor. It was certainly plausible. His body grew rigid. He met Brant's stare and knew that he had arrived at the same deduction. Perhaps that would explain the stablemaster's presence here. He had come to scope out possible suspects. Archer felt something take hold of his body as his gaze perused the room, meeting familiar and unfamiliar faces in turn. Could someone here know his secret? The dark downturn of the conversation, along with his luck, made Archer signal a footman to call for his carriage. He made his excuses and left, silently beckoning for Brant to follow him at a later juncture. As he entered the foyer at Hadley Gardens 10 minutes later, an annoyed-looking Heed met him. "What is it?" Archer asked him, frowning. But before Heed could answer, a familiar gaunt figure strode from the adjoining parlour. Thompson. Archer's eyes immediately fell to the blood-stained linen dangling from the inquiry agent's hand. He didn't have to look at the delicate embroidery in the corner to see his initials stitched there. He knew his own cravat when he saw it. Despite the shot of worry that arced through him, Archer's expression gave away nothing as Thompson smiled, his eyes glittering with veiled triumph. "I believe this belongs to you." It was an unfashionable hour for a stroll or drive through Hyde Park, but Archer was there nonetheless. There would be a number of carriages tooling along the park lanes past dark, and they would be ripe for the picking. There were at least 2 balls occurring that night that Archer knew of, invitations to which he had received and politely declined. Enduring hours in a stuffy ballroom while wearing a starched suit and cravat could not hold a candle to the freedom Archer felt where he stood now, within a stand of woods near the border of Kensington Gardens. He wore his black buckskin trousers and hessians, a long black greatcoat, and his mask, of course, a guise he had not worn for weeks. It had been too long since his last outing. The jumping nerves in his arms and legs and the insistent clench of his gut were proof. "We should not be here," Brant whispered from the trees behind Archer. "Come now, Mr. Broxton, where is your sense of adventure?" he murmured in response. Brant snorted. "Playing a gentleman and riding the coattails of your influence at Wyatt's earlier was adventure enough for me, although I have yet to change out of these overstarched garments." Archer breathed in the early spring air, tracing the dank bite of the Serpentine's stagnant water. The trees had bloomed with new foliage weeks ago. They sheltered Brant and him well, especially in the darkness. "I needed to get out," Archer explained, "especially after dealing with that hound from Bow Street." Thompson's visit at Hadley Gardens had lasted over an hour, during which the zealous inquiry agent brandished the bloody cravat bearing Archer's monogram, which had been found inside Viscountess Hamilton's burgled home. Archer, sitting in his chair at his desk, his fingers laced over his stomach, had explained with forced calm that he had given the cravat to the late Duke to staunch the blood flow from a gash on his palm at the Gainsbridges masquerade. The Duke had not seen fit to return the length of linen, stained and ruined as it was. He'd also denied dropping the damned thing while robbing Lady Hamilton's home and beating her senseless. Thompson had not been so stupid as to formally accuse him of the despicable act, but there was no question in Archer's mind the man was digging to pin both the Duke's murder and the bandit's crimes on his head. That wasn't what had driven Archer into a foul temper, though. What had was the fact that the impostor had left the bloodied cravat behind on purpose in an attempt to implicate Archer, which meant the impostor had taken the cravat some time ago. The Duke would have most likely tossed the ruined linen to Heed or his valet, Porter, after the Gainsbridge affair. If that was the case, the impostor must have been inside Worthington Abbey, where he'd formulated a future use for the cravat. Who the devil was he? A servant? Or had he sneaked into the Duke's home unseen? "That Bow Street hound is precisely why we should have stayed put at Hadley Gardens," Brant replied. "You are breaking your own rules, Hawk." Archer paced a small swath of ground between 2 trees. "I'm simply restless. Waylaying a carriage and taking away a nice purse to be delivered to one of the parish churches, perhaps near 7 Dials or Whitechapel, would settle him. Besides, when he took a carriage tonight, a single carriage, no need to get cocky, he would ask the occupants to relay a message, that the real masked marauder does not steal for his own benefit, but for that of the poor. The real masked marauder does not harm women or slaughter defenseless animals. Archer would like to wake up tomorrow morning to a bold headline like that in the news sheets. "It is poor timing, and you know it," Brant said. "You did not have to come. I made that perfectly clear." In fact, he'd ordered Brant to await his return in the stables. There were only a handful of servants assigned there, but Archer did not want to risk being seen by any of them when he returned from his outing. He'd rather his staff have no reason to believe he'd left his rooms at any point during the evening. He'd gone so far as to climb from his own window and descend the trellis into the gardens and out to the curb, where Brant waited with 2 rented mounts from a nearby livery. His departure had been degrading enough as it was. He didn't want it to have all been for naught. "Someone needs to look after your reckless ass," Brant murmured, as the telltale sound of rattling tack and carriage wheels sounded down the lane. Archer let out a pent-up breath as the squall of tension within him released. He knew what to do and how to do it, and damn it if he wasn't going to give the masked marauder his reputation back. Before the impostor started on his rampage, the bandit had had a mysterious air about him, but no one had truly feared him. At the card table at White's that afternoon, He'd heard pure revulsion in the voices of the men who had, before, shrugged off the masked bandit as a petty criminal unworthy of their concern. Some part of him desperately wanted to defend his alter ego's honor. "Be careful," Brant whispered as Archer's muscles tensed and released, ready to spring. "Yes, Mother." He jumped out of the stand of trees and into the darkened lane. The approaching carriage had 2 lanterns near the driver's bench, and they threw off enough light for Archer to see the boxy shape of a brougham, pulled by 1 horse. The interior would fit 2 passengers at the most, and a single driver, perhaps a groomsman at the back. Archer relaxed even more. How many times had he waylaid such a carriage? Countless, and here in the woodsy area of the park, he could have just as well been in Essex again. As the driver's figure, outlined by the coach lamps, came into view, Archer readied his pistol. The weapon was not loaded, and never had it been for any of his outings. He knew enough about weaponry to know the dangers of a shot accidentally going off and maiming or killing a man. He would never endanger anyone's life, which made the imposter's actions that much more infuriating. The driver finally drew close enough to spot Archer standing in the center of the road. He spoke to his horse, pulling back on the reins and bringing the brougham to a halt. Once the jangling of the tack quit, Archer delivered his greeting in the silky voice he reserved for the bandit. "No displays of heroism, please," to which he expected the driver to hold up his hands in surrender, just as the others, for the most part, had always done. This driver, however, bucked tradition. He threw down the reins to his horse and stood from the driver's bench. As he descended from the bench, Archer took in the shape of him. Well over 6 feet, and possessing the breadth of an ox, the driver looked like a bear clad in fine livery. "Stay where you are, my friend," Archer advised, the smooth cadence of his voice faltering. "I ain't your friend," the driver said, though to Archer's ears it sounded less like a voice and more like a handful of stones being ground to dust. The driver reached into the footboards of the bench and drew something out. "No one need risk injury tonight," Archer said, the pulse in his throat beginning to throb. "I simply require the valuables of your patrons." The driver advanced while a female voice inside the brougham called out, asking why they had stopped. Archer fixed his eyes on the flintlock pistol the driver carried in his hand. This is going all wrong. For the first time since he'd started this whole charade, he doubted the sense of it all. No one had ever challenged him, a dangerous masked highwayman. Nobility didn't generally rise to the fight. They cowered, they spluttered and complained, but they always shrank away from Archer, from his masked face and the threat of injury. And hired help? Well, they certainly did not get paid handsomely enough to risk life and limb for their masters. "Lawrence?" the clipped female voice called, clearer this time. The door to the carriage opened, distracting Archer's attention from the approaching giant. His eyes stuck to the lady as she popped her head out and turned to see what was amiss. Hell, he recognized her as one of Brynn's friends, Lady Cordelia Vandermeer. Without a moment's hesitation, the chit screamed. The high blood-curdling pitch slammed into his ears and echoed through the park. Her driver Lawrence did the exact opposite of what Archer expected him to do. Instead of turning and rushing to his mistress's side, he raised his pistol and charged at full speed. Archer flipped his useless pistol in his hand and brought the butt across the driver's hand, knocking the man's unfired weapon aside. The shot didn't go off, not even when the pistol hit the lane. The driver tackled Archer to the gravel. He had at least 10 stone on Archer, if not more, but he used the beast's own momentum against him, tossing the driver overhead and onto the lane. The marginal victory did not last long. Archer barely made it to his feet when the driver successfully set upon him again, bringing him to the ground. Almost instantly, however, the driver's weight was taken from his back, and Archer heard the grunts of another, the sounds of knuckles on flesh. He spun around to find Brant pummeling the driver with his fists, and then taking a hook to the nose in return. Lady Cordelia's screams for help were getting farther and farther away, but as Archer pulled the driver off Brant, the sounds of shouting men drew alarmingly close. The driver tossed Archer off and dove to the ground. Even in the darkness, and with the silk mask tugged askew and half blinding him, Archer knew the man was lunging for the dropped pistol. Before he could take a breath or even think to run, a pair of hands shoved hard against his chest, knocking him aside. The report of the pistol split through Archer's ears as he hit the gravel lane. He tore off the mask and, with his vision restored, saw Brant on the ground where he had just been standing. "No!" He rushed to his friend and bent over him. "You bloody fool!" He received a groan in answer and a rough shove against his arm. "Go!" Brant rasped in pain. "Get out of here, there are others coming." The driver was already running toward the sounds of the men's voices, shouting, "Here! Over here! The masked bastard is here!" Archer tried to pull Brant to his feet, but the rasp of pain turned into a grating growl. "I'm shot, damn you! Leave me here and go!" "There is no chance in hell. I cannot walk. Go, Archer! The sodding driver knows I'm not the bandit. I'm still dressed as Broxton. I'll think of something. Get out of here." Brant shoved him away once again, and this time Archer got up. "You'd better be a damned good liar and get yourself out of this, or else I will come forward." And with that Archer turned. He hated leaving his friend there, but he knew he wouldn't be able to help Brant if they were both in prison. With a growl of frustrated rage, he fled. Chapter 21. Brynn stared helplessly at her betrothed, sitting slumped and defeated in the chair behind the massive desk. Archer was knee-deep in a bottle of whiskey and seemed intent on drowning himself in the rest of it. She had come to Hadley Gardens the minute she had heard the news that a man had been arrested in conjunction with the Masked Marauder and tied to an attack the night before. She had not, however, known that it was Brant, Archer's friend and stable-master. It did not surprise her that Archer still considered the man a friend, despite the differences in their social standings. They had been childhood friends in Essex, and Brynn knew that Archer valued Brant's unswerving loyalty, and vice versa. Enough to try to save his liege's neck, it seemed. She had gotten part of the story from Cordelia, and the rest in broken bits and pieces from Archer, and was still trying to make sense of it. Why Archer had felt compelled to don his mask and waylay a coach on a darkened side street, Brynn had no idea. Perhaps it had been to show that the true Masked Marauder was not a killer. Regardless of his intent, it had not gone well. Because of the impostor, the driver had been armed and had not bowed to Archer's requests, and Brant had been shot. In the aftermath, a discarded mask had been found next to Brant. He had attempted to tell the constable that he had arrived on the scene only after hearing the commotion. Unable to prove his identity, however, they did not believe him and arrested him on sight. "It's my fault," Archer muttered, raking a hand through his dishevelled hair and reaching for his empty glass. Brynn strode forward and removed the glass along with the bottle. "You've had enough." He eyed her as if doubting she was really there. "Why are you here?" he slurred. "Come to celebrate your freedom." "My freedom?" "From our engagement. Haven't you heard? I am a suspect. Found my bloody cravat, and now they think I killed my father, for real this time. Thompson's grasping for straws, and I am one of them." She glared at him and crossed the room to close the study door before returning to his side. "I am well aware of that, Archer. You need to collect your wits and figure a way out of this. This impostor is targeting you. Come now, you don't strike me as the sort of man who simply gives up, which is what you are doing by drinking yourself into a stupor." He grasped her wrist as she leaned over him. "Why are you doing this?" She flushed, his touch igniting a fire underneath her skin. "You know why." His haunted dark grey eyes searched hers, and Brynn couldn't help herself. She brushed a curling lock of dark hair back from his brow. Her fingers stroked his skin with soft, gentle touches. He closed his eyes and leaned against her palm. Somehow the pleasure the intimate gesture gave her rivaled the pleasure his kisses usually did, and something profoundly delicate blossomed in her heart. "You should separate yourself from me before this gets any worse." Her hand slid to his chin, and she grasped it firmly, twisting his face toward hers. "Regardless of what future lies between us, I care about what happens to you, and I won't abandon you now. Pull yourself together and fight, damn it!" She didn't care about her language. She wanted to make him react, but her provoking words only made him shrug. What would you have me do?" Brynn eyed his unshaven face, thinking how vulnerable and unbearably handsome he looked with the dark shadow along his jawline, and without his usual arrogant smirk. "Have a bath, for one, and sober up." She opened the study door and told the footman there to summon Heed. The butler arrived within seconds. "Heed, please have the Duke's valet prepare a bath." The man bowed without a word at her unorthodox command, though Brynn swore she could see a slight softening in his eyes. It was clear that Archer's servants adored him, including Heed, whose impervious demeanour never wavered. "Thank you, Heed. Oh, and please ask the cook to prepare something simple for his grace once he has finished." "My lady." Archer got up and stumbled past her on his way to the door. "Already giving my staff orders, I say." Brynn ignored the comment and paced in the study after he had left. There had to be a way out of this calamity, something they hadn't yet thought of. Brant's possibility of bail had been revoked in the interests of public safety, and Thompson and his cronies were on a witch hunt. They were no longer interested in finding the true killer, which meant that task must fall to those who still cared, a number that she could count on one hand. Even if Archer weren't implicated, Thompson would do everything in his power to tie the stablemaster to Archer once his identity was confirmed. Archer had told her of the bloody cravat, but anyone could have planted the item. Archer's alibi was solid. He was at his own engagement ball when the attack on poor Lady Hamilton occurred, but Brant had not been. Thompson was relentless, and she was certain he was wily enough to fabricate gossamer links between the evidence at hand and what had actually happened. Brynn also wagered he was not above using the newspapers to drive the public into a frenzy. She thought about confiding in Grey, and then shook her head. No, Grey would not understand. He would lock her up in Bishop House, or ship her back off to Essex without a qualm. He would be concerned only for her safety and what might happen if she were attacked. At the thought, Brynn suddenly had an epiphany. She frowned, turning the idea over in her mind. It was a long shot, but it could work. She needed only to convince Archer of its soundness. She glanced at the ornate grandfather clock at the far end of the study. Archer would be gone for an hour or more, so Brynn settled herself into a comfortable armchair to wait and leaf through a book from one of the well-stocked shelves. She read the words, but they disappeared from her memory, it seemed, moments later. She was far too distracted by the idea she'd formed. She was halfway through the book when the study door opened and Archer walked back in. His eyes looked more lucid, and the defeat in them was gone. Freshly shaven, with his hair still wet, and clad in only a white chamois shirt and tan breeches with shiny hessians, he looked utterly desirable. "Feel better?" she asked, a trifle breathless. "Yes, thank you, Brynn." His words were interrupted as Heed announced himself, opening the door to escort the waiting footman in with a large tray. Brynn nodded to the desk, and the footman set it down, uncovering the dishes and laying out the silverware. She smiled her thanks to Heed and noted with surprise that his lips actually drew up at the corners before he bowed stiffly and left the room. "What's this?" Archer asked, even though she knew he had heard the exchange with Heed. "You need to get something in your stomach other than drink." As Archer sipped some of the broth, Brynn took a deep breath. It was now or never. "The Kensington ball is 2 days hence. We should plan to go." He frowned at her, and she rushed to get the rest of her thoughts out before she lost her nerve. "I will wear the Bradburn diamonds and make every effort for it to be known in all the ladies' circles, no matter how vulgar such boasting may appear. If our bandit is indeed a gentleman, this will be a prize not to be missed. We will lure this impostor to us and clear Brant's name." Archer stared at her, a muscle starting to tick in his jaw, his eyes going glacial. "Absolutely not. I won't have you risking your neck for mine." "It is our only chance," she argued. "We will leave separately, and you will follow the coach. Once he attacks, you will be able to catch him." "No, you needn't worry for my safety. I will have my pistol with me, and as you are well aware, my marksmanship is excellent." She said the last with a smile, one that faded at the violent look on his face. "No." Archer rose in slow motion and walked to where she stood on the other side of the desk. She stared up at him, refusing to give up on her plan as they faced each other nose to nose. Her breathing hitched at his nearness. and the clean scent of his freshly scrubbed skin. "No," he said more gently. Archer leaned down as if he meant to kiss her, but a moment before their lips touched, he turned away to return to his seat. Brynn felt bereft of him, her body utterly desolate at the loss. He met her eyes, his voice a pained rasp. "The impostor has a tendency toward violence. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you." His whispered words made her heart clench. Archer did care about her. She had wondered after he had touched her so intimately. Brynn was new to navigating the waters of seduction, but not naive. She had no illusions that the Duke loved her, though she also knew he wouldn't be so adamantly against her plan if he didn't care for her a little. That tiny knowledge gave her a boost of much-needed confidence. "That's it, then, we're agreed." "We are not. Archer, I forbid it." She smiled at him, despite the low warning in his voice. "We are not yet married, my dear Duke, and as such I do not require your permission, nor am I forced to obey your wishes. Should we escape the gallows and agree to swear by our marriage vows, I will endeavour to be your ever-obedient wife. But until then, my will is my own." She almost laughed at his look of shocked incredulity. "Now eat. I shall take myself for a stroll, where I will declare to all and sundry my intention to wear the Bradburn diamonds to the Kensington crush. Wish me luck." Impulsively she walked around to the side of the desk and placed a swift kiss atop his head, not noticing the hand that snaked around her waist until she tried to step away. Brynn swore under her breath. She should have left, but she couldn't bring herself to do it without touching him just once. Unable to move with his hand clamped around her, they stared at each other in charged silence. Brynn could see the turmoil in his eyes, and without thinking, she leaned down and sealed her lips to his. Archer reacted after a half-beat of frozen surprise, sweeping her into his lap and claiming her mouth with desperate urgency. His tongue duelled with hers as she dug her fingers into the soft linen of his shirt and pushed her breasts tight to his chest. She was as greedy for him as he was for her. The interior of his mouth tasted faintly of whiskey and mint. The combination was intoxicating, and she clung to him, unable to get enough. What was it about this man that made her want wildly indecent things? All it took was the press of his lips and the reckless thrust of his tongue, and Brynn found herself ready to capitulate to anything. He made her weak, and yet, in his arms, she'd never felt more powerful. After a long interlude, Archer lifted his head and stared at her in baffled wonderment. "What am I going to do with you? You are infuriating, maddening, impulsive, and so damned stubborn it takes my breath away. I cannot deter you from this foolhardy plan." Brynn stared at his face, her heart in her eyes. "No," she said softly. "You cannot." "Why?" Her answer was the same as the one she had given him before, although this time her voice trembled with the force of the emotion behind it. "You know why." Archer may not love her, but Brynn knew that what she felt for this man was unlike anything she had ever felt before. It was all-consuming, exhilarating, terrifying, and it filled her body and her heart to bursting. She didn't know if it was love, but she did know that if anything happened to him, her life would be forever altered. She couldn't imagine seeing him punished for crimes he did not commit. Brynn would do whatever she could to prevent that from happening. Archer didn't speak as he pulled her toward him, cradling her head in the hollow where his shoulder met his chest. She fit perfectly, her body moulding itself to his. Brynn didn't speak either, but she could feel their heartbeats aligning, and that felt more perfect than any words ever could. Brynn stood in the front sitting room at Bishop House and smoothed her gloved hands over the layers of the emerald-green chiffon. The gown she'd chosen for the Kensington ball was a favourite among all her dresses and gowns for the season, and she'd wanted to save it for a truly special evening. She hadn't imagined that such an evening would include catching a thief and a killer. Braxton had just announced the arrival of the Duke, and her palms were fairly sweating. That was it. There could be no turning back now. Her parents had declined the invitation to the Kensington ball in favour of another that they had previously accepted and had already left for that affair. Unfortunately, Grey had been charged with escorting Brynn to the Kensingtons and representing the Dinsmore name, which had left Brynn scrambling to concoct a diversion to keep her brother occupied until after she'd left for the ball, alone. Of course, Archer would be trailing her on horseback, so she would not truly be alone. It would seem that way to only the impostor, should he have heard the rumours that the Bradburn diamonds were out and about for the evening. She took a deep breath and glanced at herself in the bevelled glass. Her hair had been twisted into a loose chignon with a few strands left free to fall in heavy ringlets down her back. The style displayed the Bradburn diamonds to perfection. The ostentatious gems glistened at her throat, the last tear falling into the hollow of her breasts. Mary, one of the undermaids, had outdone herself with the elegant hairstyle. Lana had not been at Bishop House when Brynn had started to prepare for the ball, and for good reason. She had whispered a desire to travel to the ball alone, without alerting or alarming Grey, and Lana had promised that she would see to it. So far her maid had been true to her word. Brynn had not seen hide nor hair of her brother or her maid since late morning. Brynn, too, had played her part well and had flaunted her intent to wear the priceless necklace yesterday at a tea hosted by Cordelia and her mother. Not one invited lady had declined, including Archer's sister, which meant the tea-room in Lady Vandermeer's home on Grosvenor Square had been overwhelmed with women, young and old, all of whom sat agog while Cordelia accounted her lurid tale of the attack on her carriage in Hyde Park. Brynn had sipped her oolong while sitting beside Eloise, listening to Cordelia's timorous voice, but thinking of Archer and his friend, Brant, instead. All eyes had been on Cordelia, her teacup shaking in her hand until she had finally needed to set it down. However, Brynn still felt as if she were hiding in plain sight, and that at any moment one of the ladies would look at her and just somehow know. Of course no one did. No one yet knew who the man arrested in Hyde Park was. He had purportedly not given his identity and was being held in Newgate. Brynn imagined he was being questioned heavily by Thompson. She didn't want to consider what more was happening to Archer's trusted friend inside that abominable stone fortress, though she imagined Archer had been able to think of nothing else. Despite cringing inside at how shallow she appeared, Brynn had found a way to bring up the Bradburn diamonds and her plans to wear them to the Kensington ball. Most of the younger ladies had simpered along with her, but she had seen vaulted brows from some of the more experienced ladies of the ton, and had felt the sting of their contempt. Eloise had not said a word, though she had been more reserved for the rest of the afternoon. Granted, discussing fashion and diamonds so soon after Cordelia's harrowing tale had been gauche, but she could not waste time caring about what anyone thought of her. "I can do this," she whispered to herself in the glass. Braxton stepped into the sitting-room and announced the Duke. Brynn turned from the mirror and caught her breath as Archer filled the entrance. As he strode farther into the room, she felt the strangest reaction. Her palms grew even more hot and damp, and yet the nerves churning her stomach instantly settled. Having him here put her at ease, even if she wasn't completely comfortable being left alone with him as Braxton took his leave. It didn't make any sense, and yet there it was. He stared at her, a slow, appreciative grin lifting the corners of his mouth. "Well, you've done it. No thief worth his salt will be able to resist that display." His eyes glittered as they took in the diamonds and the expanse of décolletage they rested upon. The skin there grew warmer under his gaze, and Brynn, without thought, touched the tips of her fingers to the lowest tier of jewels. Archer's breathing hitched, and his jaw shifted as he followed her movement. "You take my breath away." She flushed at the amorous look in his eyes as they devoured her, sweeping to her breasts and then back to her face. She lowered her hand. "Thank you, my lord." He was clad in raven-black attire from head to toe, with the exception of his shirt and cravat. Brynn hadn't thought it possible that he could be any more attractive, but he had somehow managed it. He lowered his voice and came closer to her. "It's not too late to change your mind." "I won't lie," she admitted. "I am terrified this plan of mine will succeed in drawing the impostor out, but your friend in Newgate must be even more terrified than I." Archer grimaced and cut his eyes from her. "You don't know Brant. He doesn't scare easily. Still, he will not be there much longer. No, she did not know Archer's friend well at all. However, she had come to know Archer, though she didn't know how or when exactly. "You plan to turn yourself in?" He wouldn't look at her as he crossed the room in the opposite direction of her, toward a divan near the hearth. The fire was small in the grate, and it threw weak light over his figure. He stood with his back to her, the fingers of his right hand twisting the Duke's signet ring upon the third finger on his left hand. "I will not allow him to rot in that filthy hole, and if Thompson recognizes him as the man my footman dragged in at Hadley Gardens the night of my father's murder—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Brynn could suddenly feel how tenuous the whole situation was. The tightrope Archer had been walking the last few days. She felt a surge of empathy and wished she could do more to lessen his burden. "You care for him," she said as she walked toward the hearth. He continued to stare into the flames. "He is a brother to me," he replied, still twisting his signet ring. He was always so cool and unflappable, and this nervous twitch of his was the first bit of vulnerability he'd shown her. Brynn wanted to reach for him, to take his restless hands and hold them firmly in her own. The urge was so keen it left an ache in her. "I haven't changed my mind about tonight," she said. "Catching the impostor is the only way through this." He turned his ear toward her but stayed facing the hearth. "There is another option." Brynn gave in to her craving and settled her hands lightly on the broad width of his back. "Even if you were to turn yourself in, the impostor would still be out there. The robberies will continue, and he'll keep harming people. We are the only ones who know he is not the true bandit. We must stop him, Archer. I know you don't want to allow Brant to rot in Newgate, but I won't allow you to be escorted to the gallows." He lifted his head at her touch and stopped twisting his ring. His body went rigid under her hands, his ribs expanding with a held breath. "Only a coward would let another man take the fall for his own crimes. I am many things, but a coward is not one of them." Brynn swept her hands up to where his muscled shoulders widened, curving her palms around each muscled one. He was so big and strong. She wanted to cling to him, if only to stop him from marching to Bow Street and turning himself into Thompson. "But you have not committed the crimes worthy of hanging. The impostor is the violent one, not you." There was a difference between the two bandits, as clear as the divide between night and day. Archer laughed. "I am a highwayman, Brynn, and last I knew that was crime enough worthy of the noose." She let go of his shoulders and circled around to stand before him. "You do not keep what you take, you give it to the poor." "The magistrate would not give a damn about that." "I give a damn." She sealed her lips the moment the curse was out. The man made her want to swoon and swear in equal measure. Archer's tensed shoulders softened. Firelight reflected in his eyes as he cupped her cheek, his gloved hand sliding like silk against her skin. She gathered a breath and held it. "I mean, I care. I don't want anything to happen to you or your friend. Not when you were only trying to do some good," she said, adding, "as misdirected as it was." His mouth quirked into a half-grin before falling somber once again. "Why do you care? I've been a beast to you." Brynn shook her head. Archer's fingers raked lower down the slope of her neck. She didn't know how to answer. Why? It was a fine question, one she wasn't quite certain how to answer. Honestly, when Archer had confessed his darkest secret, that he was the Masked Marauder, she had felt a slap of repulsion. Explaining what he did with the items he stole had allayed that feeling, though only slightly. She'd wondered at his endgame. Did he not think he would ever get caught? What kind of fool acted so recklessly without a care for his own title and lands? At some point, without even realizing it, the answers had struck her. A man who did these things was a man who cared deeply and passionately, a man who was willing to risk himself and everything he had in order to make a difference in the only way he knew how. If Archer's father hadn't sunk the Bradburn dukedom's finances to such depths, Archer would have given everything to his cause, a cause Brynn found herself caring for, simply because he did. She had heard whisperings from the Countess of Thorndale at Cordelia's tea about several mysterious and large donations that had been received for the new children's hospital on the outskirts of London. Brynn suspected the donations had been from Archer, and even though thievery was wrong, she had to admire his skewed sense of nobility. Archer stroked the nape of her neck, his fingers threading through the loose ringlets. Brynn's lids fluttered shut at the delicate sensation. "I suppose I've come to understand what you intended to do, and you aren't a beast," she whispered, a delectable shiver unfurling deep in her stomach. "Not when you touch me like this." He scraped his fingers around her nape and tensed them. "I'm a wolf, and you know it." She opened her eyes and found he'd angled his head lower. Instead of alarm, Brynn felt anticipation. "Well, perhaps you are," she said, her eyes on his mouth. "But wolf or not, I don't want anything to happen to you." His expression pinched. "You have your pistol in your reticule." She pulled back at the question, the mention of her pistol jarring. His grasp at the back of her neck wouldn't let her go far. "If we must carry out this plan, I need to know you will shoot the bastard if anything goes wrong." He tugged her closer, until the tips of their noses brushed together. "I need to know you will be safe." Brynn nodded, beset by the intensity of his request, of his stare and the possessive hand clutching at her nape. It was as if he never wanted to release her. "I promise," she said. Before she could take another breath, Archer kissed her, the pressure of his mouth just as demanding as his request for her to use her pistol well. He parted her lips with his tongue, and stole inside with a savage need. He'd called himself a wolf, and this kiss had a dangerous edge, but she knew in her heart that he wasn't trying to be a beast. He clung to her, devouring her with his kiss, because he was afraid. He wanted to shield her from harm, and tonight he feared he wouldn't be able to do so. That knowledge, she knew, was gutting him. Brynn opened to him, allowing him to sink deeper, closer. How had she learned so much about this man? To know the distinctions between his kisses and what each one meant underneath their passionate surface frightened her. "I know him as I never thought I would," she thought, as his hands travelled down the back of her gown and over her rump, crushing her against his body. "I love him as I never thought I would." Heat and shock flared inside Brynn's chest, and she gasped against his mouth. Archer pulled back. "What is it?" he asked, concern leaping in his gaze. I think we should get on with things before I lose my nerve," she answered, her eyes falling away. He took a deep breath and nodded upon releasing her. "And I mine," he said. "I'll leave through the front door and have my driver take the carriage to King Street. I have a mount waiting for me there. I'll double back and wait for your conveyance to pull away from Bishop House. I'll follow you at a close distance." "How will I know you?" she asked, eyeing his attire. He would stick out sorely as he was, and would most definitely have thought to bring something to cloak himself with. "I'll be wearing a greatcoat and a hat with plumage," he answered, with a quick peck to the tip of her nose. "I'll look positively dandy." Brynn tried to smile, but her fractured nerves were doing strange things to her facial muscles. "Relax," he told her. "The impostor may well spring upon you after the ball, if at all." He left her at the hearth and strode into the foyer. Once Brynn heard the door close behind him, she met Braxton in the sitting-room entrance. "Call for my carriage," she instructed, and with a bow he left to see it done. The next several minutes waiting were tortuous. She left Bishop House only when she knew Archer had been given plenty of time to exit his carriage and take up his waiting mount, then come back and watch for her departure. Braxton helped Brynn up into her waiting coach, and closed the door behind her with a short bow. When they pulled away from the curb a moment later, Brynn felt as if she might be ill. Archer was correct, of course. The ball would go on into the small hours of the morning, and that would be an ideal time for the impostor to pounce, if he planned to at all. If he did have a connection to Archer and the late Duke, he may very well avoid Brynn altogether. Suddenly she felt silly for believing she could draw him out by wearing the diamonds. They were too well known a piece, and if he pawned them, they would no doubt be recognized. She sat against the back cushions and let out a breath. Archer was behind her somewhere on the street, and for nothing at all. He'd have to return to his carriage on King Street and then be late for the ball. What a waste. With that thought, Brynn's coach came to a stop. The Kensingtons' home was still another 10 minutes away, so they could not have already arrived. She sat forward, biting the inside of her cheek, and listened. There wasn't a sound, except for the distant clop of horse hooves and normal street noises, muted, though, as if the carriage had drawn off the main road. "Beckett," she called to her driver. "Sorry, my lady," came his answer. "There was a section of road closed off, and I needed to make a—" His sentence ended with a grunt, and the whole coach rocked violently. Something was happening up in the driver's box, and Brynn knew exactly what it was. She grabbed her reticule and felt around inside for her pistol. Deuce it, she should have had the thing ready. The cool metal grip hit her palm, and she pulled out the lady's pistol, aiming the short barrel at the door, the tasselled curtain over the window shaking as the coach made its final rocks. Beckett had not made another sound, and with a surge of self-disgust, Brynn realized she hadn't thought of any risk to him the bandit may pose. If anything happened to Beckett, she would never forgive herself. Without thought or plan, she opened the coach door with her free hand. Lifting the hem of her voluminous skirts, she jumped the 2 feet to the ground. Her shins ached on impact, but she turned immediately for the bench and came face to face with a masked man. Brynn raised her pistol, but even with Archer's demand to shoot still fresh in her mind, could not pull the trigger. The masked man was tall and broad like Archer, but not in a fit or regal way. He wore the same sort of guise Archer had that night on the lane to Worthington Abbey, but his black mask hid a rounder face. His posture was slovenly, and he'd chosen a black cape rather than a greatcoat. He also did not have the smooth, gentlemanly manner Archer had possessed, even while demanding coin and jewels. "No displays of heroism, please," he said in a mocking voice. "Hand them over." The diamonds. Her half-cocked plan had worked. "No," Brynn managed to say, her finger numb on the trigger. He took a step forward, and she saw he held a pistol in his own hand. Beckett looked like he was laid out in the driver's bench. "We both know you won't shoot me," the man said. "I, however, will," came a steady voice behind Brynn. Archer, thank God. Still, she didn't lower her weapon. The impostor didn't startle, she noticed, and that gave her pause. "Your weapon isn't loaded. It never is," he stated. Brynn held her breath. Archer had admitted as much weeks before in his mother's salon. "It is tonight. Who are you?" Archer asked. They were on a quiet side street stuck between lamp-posts set 20 or so yards apart. She saw figures ahead passing under the lamplight, but they had not seemed to notice the waylaid carriage in the centre of the street. Either that or they had and had decided to look the other way. "A person no one cares to notice," the man said with detectable amusement, as if what he'd said had been funny. "Drop your pistol," Brynn said, her wrist shaking from the tension up and down her raised arm. "Give me the diamonds," was his reply. "Brynn, step aside," Archer said, his voice deadly calm. She did, moving closer to the coach. "Now, you lecherous bastard, I suggest you—" Archer's sentence was cut off, just as Beckett's had been, with a grunt and the sound of a commotion behind her. Brynn made the mistake of spinning around to see what had happened to him. Her eyes had barely taken in the sight of Archer, unmoving on the ground with a hooded figure standing over his body, when a hand clamped over her mouth. The impostor's arm hooked her waist and sealed her body against his, pinning her arms to her sides. He squeezed her wrist until a sharp pain cracked through the small bones, forcing her to drop the pistol. Her muted screams filled his palm instead of echoing out to passers-by as she thrashed. She did have one weapon left, however, and by all that was holy she would use it. Brynn opened her mouth and bared her teeth, biting into the meaty flesh just under his thumb. It tasted like salted cod and dirt, but she continued to clamp her jaw until the man released her with a howl. She stumbled away and tried to run to Archer and the shorter, hooded man, but the impostor grabbed her arm, pulled her to a stop, and spun her to face him. She saw a hand flying at her head, felt an agonizing blow to her cheek and nose that rattled everything in her skull, and then nothing more. Chapter 22. Archer's eyes creaked open and then closed once again at the excruciating pain pulsating through his head. He blinked gingerly as waves of nausea followed. It took him a full minute to get his bearings, and then awareness came rushing back. En route to the Kensingtons, their plan had worked. He'd had the masked impostor at the end of his pistol, but some unseen assailant had attacked him from behind, a blow to his head. Oh, God. Brynn. His eyes searched for her in the darkness and settled on a dim shape at the far side of the room. The emerald silk dress lay like a shroud around her, but he could see the slight rise and fall of her shoulders. She was still alive. He exhaled, relief swamping him. If that bastard and his accomplice had hurt her, they wouldn't have lived to see the light of day. He blinked again, his eyes adjusting to the shadows of the room. The smell of horses and dung permeated the air. They were in a mews, but where he did not know. Forcing himself to think clearly, he assessed the situation. His hands were bound behind his back, and something filthy was pulled tight across his mouth. A damp and sticky wetness coated the skin of his brow and made his eyelids heavy. Archer knew it was blood, even though he could not feel the sting of an injury. He could smell its rusty and metallic odor. What he didn't know was how bad the wound was and whether or not he could free himself and rescue Brynn before their unknown assailant came back. For now they seemed to be alone. Archer took in his surroundings, looking for weapons or anything sharp that he could use to loosen the ties around his wrists. If they were in a mews, then where were the grooms? Someone should be here. But there were no sounds, except for the gentle nicker of horses in the neighboring stalls. His head still felt cottony, and his tongue pushed against the disgusting rag in his mouth as he attempted to swallow. He assumed that they were still in London, but there were hundreds of carriage houses to choose from. His eyes narrowed on the rows of tack. Archer frowned, his stare travelling in reverse to stop on a familiar saddle, polished to a burnished shine. His own saddle. At least it looked like his. Was this Hadley Gardens? As he squinted around the stall another time, his befuddled senses clearing, he was certain it was. His relief was short-lived as he realized why the carriage house was empty. No one was here. This was one of the few nights during the week the grooms were off. Normally Brant would be hanging about, but of course he was stuck facing a nightmare of his own in a dank cell. And if Archer didn't free himself and Brynn, his friend would stay there for the rest of his days. Archer renewed his struggles, scooting backward until he came to a centre post. He pushed through the rabid throbbing of his skull and sawed at his ropes using the post's splintered edge. Once he felt them loosening, he increased his efforts. "Archer!" Brynn's voice was muffled, and he realized her mouth was also bound. "Here," he managed, limited by the gag, watching as she pulled herself into a sitting position. Her hands were tied as well, but lay on her lap instead of behind her. Having adjusted to the dim light, he saw a trickle of blood under her nose and a flowering purple bruise on the side of her temple. Archer's fists clenched, and his earlier vow to beat their assailants into a fine mash returned. She lifted her hands to tug the dirty brown cloth from between her lips. "Where are we?" she asked. "Hadley Gardens, I think." He hoped she could understand his muffled words. "Are you hurt?" she asked, and then gasped as her eyes too adjusted to the gloom. "You're bleeding." "A scratch." His tongue pushed against the soiled scrap, pressing into his mouth, the foul taste of it making him heave. "Can you shout for help?" he choked past it. Brynn nodded and did as he asked, opening her mouth and yelling out, "Is anyone there? Hello? Help us, we're in here." "We'll have none of that, if you please, my lady." They both stilled as the heavy wooden door pushed open. The same man from earlier entered the stall holding a pistol, and this time he wore no mask. Archer frowned, fighting to recall his face. He could not always recall names, but faces he never forgot. There was no recognition, though. He was certain he had never seen this man before tonight. The man was tall and swarthy and dressed in the midnight garb of the Masked Marauder, with the exception of the mask. Archer glanced to the door, but no one else entered. The second man, the one who had come up behind Archer and knocked him senseless, had to be here somewhere. He needed to remain alert and focused. His life depended on it, as did Brynn's. And Brant's, he supposed, who would take the fall for everything should this cretin get away. A lethal calm descended upon him as he assessed their assailant. The killer's clothes were of decent quality, which marked him as a man of some means, and he seemed well groomed, but Archer had never seen him before, certainly not in any of his social circles. He grunted against the rag, and the man approached, keeping his weapon trained right at Archer's heart. "Have something to say, Your Grace?" Stooping low, the man loosened the tie, pulling it out of Archer's mouth. "Sorry about this, but we couldn't have you attracting attention, could we?" Archer wanted to leap to his feet and meet the man face to face, but if he moved he would lose the splintered edge of the post. He continued to saw the ropes, hoping he appeared to be only struggling with discomfort. The ropes were slowly loosening, the twisted hemp coming apart, strand by strand. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who has benefited handsomely at your expense, it seems." "You are a cold-blooded criminal," Archer seethed, not rising to the man's bait. The man slanted an eyebrow. "If I have to be," said without an ounce of remorse. Reasoning with such a man would be pointless, but he had to keep him talking, and distracted. "Why are you doing this?" "For the riches, of course." Archer tugged on his bonds until the skin at his wrists rubbed raw. His hands were already slick with blood, but it wouldn't take much more for him to get loose. "I can pay. Release us, and you will have all the riches you desire. I give you my word." To his surprise, the man laughed, the sound echoing off the wooden rafters. "I am already well compensated, and you are meant to serve a much better purpose. After all, Bow Street already considers you a suspect. We are simply facilitating your arrest." Archer's eyes narrowed. The man knew a lot, but it was to be expected. He wouldn't have been able to find out about Archer if he wasn't meticulous by nature. "Where is your friend?" he asked casually. "The one who hit me?" "Around, making sure we remain undisturbed." The man smiled, shooting a lascivious glance toward Brynn, who had stayed silent. For the first time Archer felt a prickle of fear pool deep in his belly. Not for himself, but for her. "Touch the lady, and it will be the last thing you do," he snarled. "And how, pray tell, will you come to her defense?" the man taunted. Archer's breath stalled as the man turned toward Brynn and dragged her up like a rag doll against him. She gasped at the cruel latch of his hand on her arm, but made no other sound. "I like this dress on you," the impostor told her, "though I think I'd like it better on the floor." Archer once again battled the urge to get to his feet and charge the bastard. His bonds were almost loose, and now he redoubled his efforts, sliding his hands against each other in slow, deliberate movements. He used his own blood to help lubricate against the coarse rope. The pain kept him focused. That, and thinking in vicious detail what he was going to do to that piece of filth once he was loose. Brynn turned her face away, keeping her eyes on Archer. He could see the sheen of tears in them, but she held her chin erect. Valiant as ever, Archer thought, his chest tight with pride and fury. She wouldn't cave or grovel, not to this beast of a man. The man's hands fluttered toward the ostentatious display of diamonds attached to her throat and removed the clasp, the backs of his knuckles brushing deliberately against Brynn's breasts in the process. Archer's jaw clenched, regretting he'd ever agreed to this damned plan. He'd put her at risk and hadn't been able to protect her. He watched as the impersonator pocketed the jewels, his hand sliding down Brynn's ribcage and around to her rear. Archer would kill him, of that he was absolutely certain. Brynn struggled wildly, kicking up with her legs, not even stopping when he pressed the point of the pistol into her side. The man grinned at her as he fended off a knee aimed toward his groin and turned in slow motion to point the pistol at Archer. "One more move, lovely, and I shoot your betrothed. You can make this nice and quick, or long and painful. It's your choice." Brynn froze, her body going limp. Shutters descended over her eyes as the man ripped the chiffon dress from bosom to waist. Archer tore at his restraints with single-minded purpose. He stared helplessly at her, rage and agony eating at him. She was the only woman he had ever cared for, and he could do nothing to protect her as the bastard dipped his head to her exposed body, his fingers fumbling at the laces on her stays. Silent tears tracked her face, her bottom lip trembling with fear. With Herculean strength, Archer ripped one wrist from the rope shackle. He forced himself to move slowly, controlling his bloodlust long enough to meet Brynn's gaze. He needed her out of the way. As he waved his free hand low at his side, her eyes sparked with understanding. He set his jaw, adrenaline surging through his body like an uncaged beast. She inhaled sharply and flung her bound hands up toward the man's throat, catching him in the soft part of his lower esophagus. "You bloody bitch!" he coughed, raising the gun as he stumbled backward from Brynn's strike. But the movement was no match for Archer's savage burst of speed as he sprung to his feet and dove forward. With a guttural growl, he tackled him to the ground, the impersonator's pistol flying into the air and disappearing behind a bale of hay. The man had a stone on him in weight, but he was no contest for the demonic wrath possessing Archer. Blinded by cold fury and purpose, he straddled the man's body, his fists flying like battering rams, crunching into bone, teeth, and tissue until the man's face was an unrecognizable bloody pulp. After an eternity, Archer staggered back. He turned sharply in search for Brynn, his knuckles aching. She threw herself into his arms, and he hugged her body to his as he hauled burning breaths into his lungs. "Are you hurt?" he gasped, kissing her hair, her face, her eyes, while being careful of the ragged bruise on her cheek. "No," she whispered. Archer turned to find a knife from one of the tack shelves and snapped the bonds at her wrists. "Let's go," he said to her. But Brynn's eyes were wide and terrified as she focused on something, or someone, just beyond his left shoulder. He turned, and in disbelief saw the man he'd just pummeled unconscious standing. His face was swollen and drenched in blood, but the hand holding the short pistol he had recovered from the hay did not waver. The man's bloody mouth puckered into a smile, and his finger tightened on the trigger. Archer shoved Brynn behind him, and as a shot exploded into the silence, he braced for the pain. None came. He opened his eyes, just as the man's body fell to the ground in a thump, a bloody hole gaping at his breast. Archer whipped around, his mind a tumult of relief and confusion. A whimpering Eloise stood in the doorway, smoke rising from the muzzle of the gun in her hands. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His sister had just shot a man, saved their lives. He wanted to go to her and take the weapon from her shaking hands, but he couldn't move. His legs refused to step away from Brynn's side. With shattered gratitude, Archer nodded to Eloise and pulled Brynn to him as she collapsed, sobbing against his jacket. "It's over now," he whispered against her hair. Eloise slumped against the door, breathing hard, her hand falling to her side. Archer met her eyes, thankful for once that he hadn't insisted she accompany them to the Kensington ball. If she hadn't been here, he shuddered to think what would have happened. She must have heard a commotion in the mews, though he didn't know how or when. It didn't matter, she had come. But they were not entirely free from threat yet. He motioned her to come closer, putting a finger against his lips. "What's the matter?" she whispered. "There is a second man." Her eyes widened as she handed him the spent gun. "I don't know how to reload," she began, her entire body shivering in delayed shock. She and Brynn clutched each other as Brynn whispered her fevered thanks. "You saved us," she said. "I was only lucky that I was able to help." Eloise touched the bruise on Brynn's temple, wincing in sympathy. "We should have that looked at. You may be concussed." His sister was correct, and perhaps he himself was as well, but they had a more immediate urgency. "I need to get you both somewhere safe," Archer said. "But first, Eloise, how did you know that we were in trouble?" "I thought I heard someone shouting," Eloise explained, her voice trembling. "I knew the grooms were off, and it sounded like the shouts had come from here. So I sneaked into Father's study and took that pistol out of the gun case." Archer's eyes narrowed on the still smoking gun she had given him. He frowned, studying the shiny embossed twin barrels. He had never seen the intricate, bone-handled butt before, and he was familiar with every pistol and rifle in the late Duke's gun case. He'd shot them all at one point or another. His frown deepened as he studied the finely etched designs on the handle. This gun was decidedly not his father's. The slope of the handle had been cut to fit a much smaller hand. His blood slowed in his veins as a sticky realization took hold. His eyes met his sister's, and the fragility in them winked away, replaced by a ruthless, calculated determination. He shook his head as if his own eyes were deceiving him. "I see the game is up," Eloise commented, the shift in her voice going from pleading and frail to strong and cold. Her very appearance transformed before his eyes. In truth, he did not recognize her. Archer blinked in disbelief as his sister backed away from them, a second pistol appearing out of her cloak. She pointed it right at his head, a smile crossing her lips. Betrayal speared him like a pointed lance. "Eloise, no." "You are far too clever, brother. I should have been more careful with my words. Then again, I suppose it is so much more gratifying this way, isn't it?" "Eloise," Brynn whispered, her eyes stuck fast on the second pistol. "What are you doing?" But his sister didn't have to answer. Archer already knew. "You're the second man," he said slowly. "The other assailant." She nodded, satisfaction glinting in her icy stare. Suddenly his delicate, physically and emotionally scarred sister didn't seem so shocked, or weak, or frail. Her hands were no longer shaking. She was in utter control. "Drop your weapons, Archer." He did as she asked, if only because he sensed, with her brutally swift and seamless transformation, that she was far more dangerous than the other man had been. "Why are you doing this?" Another rapid shift swept over her, Eloise's unveiled face contorting into something demented and violent. She'd never looked at him this way before, and it chilled Archer to his very core. "Because you deserve to die, you arrogant filth. You should have died in that fire, not your mother. It was meant for you." Archer stared at her, saying nothing despite the hot burst of pain flaring along his veins and burrowing into his chest. "Meant for me," he repeated. The fire had been an accident. At least, that was what it had been determined to have been. "You set the fire." She sighed, but her answer was clear in the annoyed look she sent him, as if he was a fool, as if he should have figured it out ages ago. His mother's death had been an accident, but only because she had died in Archer's place. His sister was insane, he concluded, the sinking awareness wringing his heart and stomach together in anguish. His sister was the threat. His sister wanted him dead, them dead. He felt Brynn clinging to his side, her breath coming in a choppy rhythm. He was not Eloise's sole target any more, which meant he had to proceed carefully and stall for time. "And the Duke?" he asked, attempting to keep his voice flat. "Oh, I killed him too," she said in a bored tone. "That was unfortunate, but honestly I'm glad for it now. The man rutted everything that moved, and had the nerve to punish me for it. Do you know what it's like being born a bastard and despised every day of your life? No, of course you don't. You, after all, are legitimate." Her words were bitter, the sneer on her lips more so, but she shrugged. "I think he suspected about the fire, but he didn't have the guts, until that night in his study, to confront me about it." She smiled. "The look on his face when I told him was priceless. So yes, I killed him. After all, I didn't want him ruining my beautifully laid plans. I did you a favour, Archer. I did us both a favour." He ignored the blinding ache that spiraled through him at her confession, and struggled to keep his face unmoved. "And the Masked Marauder?" She responded in a mocking tone. "I made it my business to know everything going on at Worthington Abbey. I found your mask, followed you to Pierce Cottage. It wasn't hard to put two and two together and work out what you and that bastard of a stablemaster were doing. It's fitting that he will rot in prison, is it not? I've never liked him, always at your side like an insect. Even he thought he was better than me." "You sent the notes," Archer concluded dully. Of course I did. I took great pleasure in watching the great Archer Croft cringing at the threat of being unmasked. Her lip curled. You're nothing but a common thief. He is not, Brynn blurted. He does not keep what he takes. And that excuses the crime? Eloise laughed, the hollow sound making Archer's skin rankle. Oh, I know of the demons that drive my brother, and his desire to right a situation that can never be fixed. The Duke killed my mother, you see, left her to rot and die like the commoner she was. She didn't have the means to save herself, which was why Lady Bradburn took me in, out of guilt, and likewise my dear brother steals from his peers because of his own sorry guilt. She smiled. He loathes being born into privilege, scorns it even, while the rest of us grovel for crumbs of approval. I am not my father, Archer returned quietly. I suppose that's one good thing that could be said for you, Eloise said, eyeing him. You think your skewed sense of nobility in feeding the hungry and saving the sick makes up for his sins? Archer stared back, though not in a confrontational manner. He was not familiar with this unpredictable, volatile Eloise, and the wrong look or response could work against them. No, but at least it's something. Something worth hanging for. Archer's jaw tightened at the underlying thread of menace in her tone. Was that her plan, then, to out him to the authorities? If that is the price I must pay, then yes. Then you are more foolish than I ever gave you credit for. His sister's gaze shifted to Brynn. Light that candle over there, will you please, Lady Briannon? Archer felt Brynn stiffen at his side, and Eloise's eyes hardened at her hesitation. Do it. I warn you that I am not as soft-hearted or as stupid as that dead brute lying beside you. Brynn lit the candle and moved back to stand at Archer's side, her body trembling as she grasped the torn edges of her bodice. He wanted so much to take hold of her hand, but he knew without a doubt Eloise meant every word she said, and that she was more than capable of killing in cold blood. How had he not seen this hatred, this seething resentment before? How had he been so blind all these years? He couldn't dwell on it, however. Once more he needed to find a way out of this deadlock and get Brynn to safety. He could deal with his sister's betrayal after. You see, Eloise continued, my plan was to frame you for the Duke's murder. Poor Barnstead here was more than happy to earn his keep. He kept what he stole and altered your secret persona into something more despicable. I was going to let you hang, but this is so much better. Instead, I shall pin him as the criminal who hurt so many people and murdered my father, as well as my brother and his beautiful fiancée, all of whom are survived by poor, helpless Eloise. You plan to kill us? Brynn gasped. Oh, yes, my sweet girl. So tragic. She spread her palms with dramatic flair. Attacked by the Masked Marauder who was lured by the prize of the Bradburn jewels. She nodded at Brynn. Nice tactic, by the way. It really was a perfect ploy. She tapped her chin thoughtfully. There was a struggle. The bandit was shot, but a candle tipped over, setting the place on fire. She eyed Archer, malice dripping from her words. And you will die as you were meant to all those years ago. Something settled inside Archer at his sister's words. A new determination. He didn't know what would happen to him in the end, but he did know without a moment's doubt that he would die before allowing one more injury to befall Lady Briannon Findlay. Why, Eloise, we are friends, Brynn whispered. We were never friends, Eloise spat. You looked down on me like everyone else, and with a face like this, who wouldn't? What were my chances for happiness, of making a decent match? But what about Langlevitt? Brynn asked. He cares for you. I've seen— Shut up, or God help me, I'll make you. Eloise's words, though doused in acid, cracked. Suddenly Archer saw his opportunity. He shook his head. She doesn't care about the Earl, Brynn. After all, my mother loved her too, and she threw that away. She doesn't care about love, nor any of the people who love her. Naked pains slashed Eloise's face. She loved her precious son more. I couldn't stop her from going into a burning treehouse to look for you, could I? She died because of you. She was the one person who treated me with compassion, and you took her away from me. destabilize her, distract her. It was all he had to do before he made his move. No, Eloise, she died because of you. You set the fire. You killed her. "Shut up!" she screamed, "or I will drop your precious love like a fly." Archer deliberately pressed Brynn behind him, but Eloise only laughed madly. She raised the gun and froze. A hand holding a pistol appeared in the horse stall entrance where she stood. An arm, and then a body quickly followed it. Brynn's brother, Northridge, pressed the muzzle of his pistol to Eloise's temple. "I'll take that, thank you." Archer felt Brynn's soft exhale against his back. "Gray, how did you find us?" she cried out. Northridge's eyes flicked to his sister. "Lana told me everything, and Hadley Gardens was my first stop to find you when I heard the shot," he replied grimly, relieving Eloise of her gun, though he could not stop her from whirling out of his grasp. She dove behind a wooden saddle stand. "Don't hurt her," Archer ordered, while Northridge kept his weapon trained on her. "Get Brynn out of here. I will take care of it." Brynn rushed to her brother's side, clutching at him as Northridge wrapped his cloak around her shoulders. "I have Lana in the carriage outside. Come." "No, Archer," Brynn said, her worried eyes leaping back to him. "I won't leave you." He went to her, his need to have her gone from this wretched horse stall warring with his desire to keep her safely at his side. She would be safe with Northridge, though. Archer trusted that. "It's over, love. She can't hurt anyone now." He kissed her swiftly on the temple and nodded to her brother. Archer took Northridge's pistol and waited until they had left before addressing his sister, still hunched behind the saddle stand. "Eloise, it is finished." She stood, and the madness in her eyes had not snuffed out. If anything, it had flared. The light from the candle threw long shadows on her cheeks, making her scars there seem even more gruesome. Even after having stood at the end of her gun, after hearing her merciless plans to do away with him and the one woman he'd ever truly cared for, Archer felt a twinge of pity. The fire had burned scars on her face, but it had burned worse ones into her soul. Eloise was so consumed by hate that she would give up a chance at happiness and love just to punish him. Archer didn't know if he could forgive her, or whether she would be able to forgive herself, but he knew that he had to try. "We can work this out," he said softly. "Work what out, brother? You have a pistol aimed at me, and I have nothing." Despite his better judgment, Archer tossed the loaded weapon to the stall floor. Her eyes followed the movement and then leveled on him as if trying to see inside his heart. He would not shoot her. He could not. His sister needed help, and he would do anything to see it done. "Better?" he asked, inching closer to where she stood, eyeing him nervously. "Eloise, please listen to me. Langlevitt wants you. He has already approached me." Her fingers clutched the folds of her dress. "Don't you say that to me," she cried in a broken whisper. "He wants your hand in marriage. You have a chance to be happy." "And what of you? Will you forgive what I have done?" Archer stared at his sister and felt only deep, driving pity. Unloved and unwanted, she had twisted herself into something broken and bitter. But Archer knew that, despite all her machinations, his mother's death had been an accident. Eloise had loved her desperately. Her jealousy against him had been fortified and fed by his father's indifference. Archer swallowed hard. "I can only promise that I will try." They stood in silence, separated by the wooden saddle stand. He could almost reach for her, but he didn't want to startle her. He kept his arms and body relaxed. Emotions clashed in her eyes, the promise of happiness that lay just beyond her grasp, and the desolation of what she had done, drawing her down into its depths. "No, Archer, I don't deserve to be happy." She raised a shaking hand. It wasn't empty. Archer recognized Brynn's lady's pistol trained on his chest. He froze as Eloise knocked over the nearby candle with a flick of her wrist. Hungry flames sprouted along the dried hay at her feet and licked at the hem of her dress. "This ends now, the way it was meant to." Brynn is safe. It was all he could think of as he saw the fire spreading at his sister's back and travelling into the space between them. "Don't do this," he said, his voice hoarse, his mind racing forward to calculate how to reach Eloise without being engulfed in flames. As it was, the exit to the stall would be closed off to him within seconds. "It's not too late." "It was too late the moment I killed the only person who loved me." She smiled at him through her tears and through the flames, and for a moment Archer had a glimpse of the old Eloise, the girl he had grown up with, had loved and protected and cared for. It was as if all her scars had disappeared, and she was a young girl once more. Her eyes were light and clear, and finally filled with remorse. "I am sorry." It was then that Archer realized that she was no longer pointing the gun at him. Instead, she had turned it toward her own chest. He lurched forward, but his feet touched a wall of fire, and he jerked back, the flames singeing his trousers. "No, Eloise!" "Don't think too badly of me, brother," she whispered. And then she pulled the trigger. Chapter 23. It made little sense that people would spend summers in town instead of out in the country, Archer thought, as his horse trotted along the dirt lane, undulating through 2 fields of new spring grass. The blades were so pale they neared chartreuse. Essex's air was clean and fresh, and by midsummer it would be scented by fields of wildflowers, hay, and meadow-sweet. He breathed it in, his hold on his reins loose, his posture unusually relaxed. London was sticky, dusty, and smelly, and right then it was also a hotbed of gossip revolving around the events that had unfolded in the mews behind Hadley Gardens 2 weeks past. So much so that his removal of the marriage bans from the Times had barely garnered a reaction. Archer had cited the postponement of the nuptials on the pretext of his entering mourning for his sister, but he knew deep down it was what Brynn wanted. It was what she deserved. Now that Eloise, and the impostor, was dead, there was no need for the farce to continue. They had each known, should the impostor be outed, that there would be no wedding, that Archer would continue with his life and Brynn with hers. Their agreement was over. He pushed the thought of her from his mind with brusque finality. Archer was relieved to be gone from London for the remainder of the season. He would be more relieved when he did not wake every morning with the memories of his father's and sister's deaths already front and center in his mind. In time, the pain that accompanied those memories would pass. The clench of his stomach and the ache in his heart wouldn't be so all-consuming. He knew this from experience, of course. It had taken him years to heal after his mother's death, though now that he knew the truth, that the fire that killed his mother had been set purposely by Eloise, her intent aimed at his death, not his mother's, all the pain he'd thought he'd finally buried churned back to the surface. He needed time alone at Worthington Abbey to come to terms with all the things Eloise had revealed in her final minutes. Everything had unfolded so quickly that when the authorities had arrived at Hadley Gardens and inquired what had happened, Archer had not felt guilty in the least for lying. Preserving his sister's memory and honor had been his foremost goal, and thankfully Brynn, her lady's maid Lana, and Northridge had gone along with the story Archer had quickly concocted. The Masked Marauder had set upon the carriage taking Lord Northridge, Lady Briannon, and her lady's maid to the Kensington ball, and Archer had simply chanced upon the attack. They had all been forced back to the Hadley Gardens mews for safekeeping, while the bandits scoured the main home for the loot he'd had to leave behind on his last visit, the visit where he had beaten and killed the Duke of Bradburn. Eloise had interrupted the bandit in the mews, and she had been shot. Northridge had wrestled free of his restraints, gotten a hold of the bandit's second pistol, and had shot the bandit, though not before a lit candle had set the stable on fire. That story had been the one printed on the front page of every major newspaper in the city. It was the one that had run like wildfire through the ton. And it was the one Archer wished were true. The truth was ugly and complex and much more difficult to understand. He doubted he ever would. Archer also owed Northridge a debt that could never be repaid, not over any lifetime. His quick thinking and unflinching courage had saved Brynn, had saved him. As the rooftops of Worthington Abbey came into view, Archer gave his mount a nudge. He wanted to get home and start with the tasks that needed seeing to. Clearing out his father's and sister's rooms would hurt, but it was better done straight away rather than let it hang over him like a shroud. He had sent his staff ahead, and things should be well under way. A horse and rider sat in the middle of the lane up ahead, just before the twin pillars that marked the entrance drive to the abbey. He knew the slouch of the rider's shoulders, the low-pulled brim of his hat, and, more recently, the stiff hold of his right leg. "I've been sitting here for an hour," Brant called. "Your lack of sympathy for my injury stings, Hawk." Archer withheld the grin fighting to bow his lips. He hadn't seen Brant since his release from Newgate the morning after the Mews fire. Thompson had nothing on Brant worthy of facing the magistrate to begin with, and now, with the Masked Marauder dead, there had been no point in keeping him imprisoned. Brant had sent a message to Hadley Gardens saying he was free, but that it would be best to keep a safe distance from Archer for a little while at least. The sight of him now was a sorely needed balm. Archer wouldn't let on, of course. "One pistol wound to the thigh and 3 days in the stone jug has made you quite an old hen, my friend," Archer said, reining in his mount. "If that isn't the pot calling the kettle black, you whined like an old lady over yours, if I recall." Brant laughed, tipping back his head and shaking it. "Remind me to never take a bullet for you again." They sat atop their mounts in silence for a few moments, the good humour evaporating like morning mist. Brant squinted against the sun. "I read the Times." Archer shifted uncomfortably. He'd ridden straight through since London, and his body ached from the hours of travel. But he'd welcomed the distraction. This variety of pain was preferable to the kind he could not cure. "Do you want to tell me what really happened?" Brant asked. "Not particularly," he answered, but he directed his horse through the pillared gates and recounted everything he knew anyway. Brant deserved nothing but the truth, and he may well provide some fresh insight. Archer could use it. Unable to approach the main house just yet, he rode with Brant to Pierce Cottage. Once they'd worked together to rub down and water their mounts, Archer had finished the true version of events. He'd kept emotion out of it, but laying it bare made everything he'd buried deep inside ache. Brant hung their saddles and tack without a word while Archer waited. He crossed his arms, nerves jumping, as his friend finished stabling the 2 horses. If he hadn't known Brant so well, he'd have been growling with impatience. But Archer knew he was only carefully choosing his reply to everything he had just heard. "You're a good brother," Brant finally said, leaning against the frame of the stable doors. He crossed his arms and ankles and stared into the paddock, the ground still muddy and puddled in spots where the spring rains had not yet dried up. "Did you hear a word I said?" Archer asked. He had not expected an ounce of praise, that was for certain. "You made certain Eloise's character remained unblemished and unknown by those who did not love or care for her the way you did." Archer frowned, averting his eyes to the bales of hay stacked in the back of the stables. He had not allowed tears since the night Eloise had taken her own life. They threatened to brim now, however. "Archer," Brant said, in a way that made it clear he'd noticed. "You know as well as I that there cannot be great hatred without some fragment of love burning there to fuel it." Archer leaned against the opposite stable door jamb and faced Brant. "I believe Eloise hated herself, not you. She needed someone to bear the brunt of that hatred, because she could not accept it upon herself," Brant said. "I think she just chose the strongest person she knew." Archer swore under his breath. Strong? He didn't feel it in the least. How the devil do I get on from this? Every time I think of her, and what she suffered, the lies she told to me, to everyone. He couldn't finish. For the past 2 weeks he'd been searching his memory for the hints he had overlooked of her hatred for him. The only thing he could determine for certain was that she had been a superb actress. Brant stepped forward and clapped him on the shoulder before turning for the cottage. "You get on like we all do. Put one foot in front of the other, then the next." He paused, looking back. "I saw the second notice in the Times, too, the one postponing your wedding." Archer stayed where he was and slammed the back of his head upon the weathered wood. He did not want to remember that announcement, even though it had been a necessity. Thinking of Brynn and remembering her touch, her lips, and the desire she stirred within him had been his only source of comfort these last wearisome weeks. And yet, Thoughts of her had worn on him as well. "Have you seen her?" Brant called from where he'd limped to the cottage's front door. Archer turned to follow him. "Who? Don't be obtuse. I heard one of the house staff saying Ferndale was being readied for Lord Dinsmore and his family. They thought to take a break from London for a time as well. Ensconced in the country for the summer, it would be a place where her parents would not have to weather any direct embarrassment from the broken betrothal." He stepped into the cottage, shaking his head. It had to be done. He'd never intended to marry at all. The act had simply been a necessity, and it had been easy to stomach, considering the girl knew the game. And she'd been one hell of an ally. Everything about Briannon had impressed him. Her courage, her humour, her indomitable nature. She was everything any man could ever want. But Archer did not deserve her, this he knew. He couldn't bear the thought of disappointing her, of crushing that incredible spirit of hers. What if he turned out to be like the late Duke, just as her own brother had feared? "You are frowning," Brant commented. Cancelling the banns was the right thing to do. My reputation would ruin her good name. Brant didn't make a reply, though the crinkled forehead and frown spoke it for him. He didn't believe Archer. "So, what will you do with your time then, Your Grace?" he asked instead, dipping into a cartoonish bow. His wound must have pained him because he hissed and straightened his back without putting weight on his right leg. "You deserved that," Archer muttered, "and I will fill my time easily enough. The Marauder is dead?" Brant's question had nothing at all to do with the man Eloise had shot. His name had turned out to be Mr. Gregory Barnstead, the third son of a late baron from somewhere up in Cumbria. Barnstead had come to London with the little inheritance he'd been afforded upon his father's death, and had gambled it away within a week at a gaming hell. All of London had determined the man had been desperate, and had resorted to becoming a highwayman to make a living. He'd been bred from the gentry, and perhaps that was why he'd been polite, at first. He must have become desperate, the papers had opined, and had taken out his anger and frustration upon his victims. Archer, however, figured Eloise had found the wretched cad and had offered him a fine sum for his assistance. What Barnstead had said, about being someone no one cared to notice, made sense if he was a bitter third son of a baron. No, what Brant meant to ask was if Archer's Marauder was dead. "I do not know," he answered honestly, trying to sort through the mess of his thoughts. "It's all I have. It's all I've ever been able to offer to anyone." "That's hogwash, and you know it," Brant said. "You're afraid to give up the Marauder, Hawk. You've been using that identity as a shield for so long you've forgotten how to exist without it." Brant's words hit with barbed accuracy. Damn him. "I should go," Archer said. Not that he wanted to. Pierce Cottage, at least, felt as comforting as a home ought to. But it was time. Archer went for the door. "They are said to be arriving today, you know." Brant said it to his back, and yet the words hit low in Archer's stomach. "Don't. You love her, admit it." Archer grasped the doorknob and pulled it wide, the warm spring afternoon gusting into his face. She smelled this way, fresh and clean and with the barest hint of moss. The memory of her scent was enough to unhinge him. The girl had gotten under his skin and deep into his senses. But none of that mattered now. What if I turn out to be a bastard like my father was? What if I love her now, want her now, but the feelings fade with time? So you do love her? Archer clenched his fists, despair filling him. "Did you not hear the rest of what I said? What if one day the feeling ends? What if I can't explain it or stop it from ending?" He ran a frustrated hand through his hair, gritty from road dust. "I can't stand the idea of hurting her, of disappointing her." Brynn had given so much of herself to him. She'd risked her life pulling that stunt with the Bradburn diamonds, and when Archer had been forced, bound and gagged, to watch Barnstead put his hands all over her, he'd wanted to murder the impersonator and then flog himself for being the one who put her in danger to begin with. Archer wanted to wrap her in his arms and fight off the rest of the world. He'd indulged a vision of her for these last few weeks, of her buried under the blankets of his bed in Worthington Abbey, deep in slumber, her silky curls strewn over his pillow. There beside him, he would keep her safe. He would cherish her and ravish her in equal measure. He would do everything he could to make her smile and laugh, to make her happy in every possible way, just as he had promised her brother. I love her. You're right, Brant said, interrupting the sudden awareness that had wriggled into Archer's head. You would disappoint her. You're certainly not good enough for her, especially as the Masked Marauder with your heart under lock and key. Archer turned and eyed his stablemaster. What? You'd make all sorts of mistakes, I wager. He crossed his arms and stared at Brant, guessing his game. Would I? You'd cheat, that's for certain. You'd lie to her, too, about everything, including your marauding ways. Archer held his tongue as his friend went on. Not to mention the way you'd stop admiring her. But why wouldn't you? She's going to become a boring ninny. They all do. She would not, Archer thought to himself, half annoyed by Brant's teasing. But it had made him pause. Lying to Brynn, cheating with other women, he could not envision it. Those were the things his father had done, but had the Duke ever felt for Archer's mother the way Archer felt for Brynn? Had he ever loved her with a force that felt utterly unstoppable? A force that made him feel full to bursting, so just the idea of losing her was enough to make him feel empty, bereft of any purpose or joy. Just as he felt now. Not even the idea of continuing his raids as the Masked Marauder could fill that gaping void. It would not be enough to fill him, he knew. It would be nowhere near enough to make him happy. There was only one person who could give him that, and she could never be a part of such a dangerous and secret life. He didn't want her to be a part of it. Hell, he didn't want that life any more at all. He only wanted her. The Marauder is dead, Archer said, and repeated it more firmly as the decision took root. He's dead. It's over, Brant. Now that he held control of the dukedom's finances, he would be able to begin repairing the damage that had been done. His investments, as risky and vulgar as they might seem to other members of the peerage, would turn a profit. He would soon be able to help those who truly needed it without living the dangerous double life of a highwayman. Brant nodded before stoking the fire in the cook-stove, trying unsuccessfully to hide his grin. I'm relieved to hear it. I'm weary of saving your ass. You could have been killed, Archer said, all seriousness. I was selfish and stupid, and I will never put anyone else I care about in danger like that again. Brant put on a pot of water to boil. Apology accepted, though I wouldn't reject an additional offer to pay my tab at the village tavern. Archer laughed. You'll sink me before I'm afloat again. He rested his hands on the back of a chair at the long supper table, a sense of peace descending upon him. Pulling out the nearby chair, he felt too restless to sit and turned back for the door. He'd feel restless until he stepped inside Worthington Abbey as its master for the first time. Until he entered its grand foyer and felt how completely and utterly alone he was there. Then again, with Briannon, he would never be alone. Unlike his father, he knew he could be a worthy husband. He also knew he'd do whatever it took to make himself worthy of her. So, Brant said, with a knowing laugh as if he could see right through him, when are you planning to tell the lady of your intentions? His answer must have been written all over his face, because Brant grinned and clapped him on the back. Go get her, Hawk, he said. He knew he must. Archer left the cottage with a fire under his heels. Chapter 24. The evening sun descended beyond the rolling hills of Ferndale, spreading rose-tinged fingers across the meadows and dusting the countryside with a golden sheen. A few dark clouds threatened on the horizon, but they only added to the beauty of the burgeoning twilight. Brynn tore her eyes from the windows and watched as the footman cleared the last of the dinner plates, her gaze locking with her mother's fraught one across the ornately set dining table. Though it was only a quiet family dinner, Brynn longed to escape to the solitude of her chambers, and from the fretful eye of her mother. Lady Dinsmore had taken it to heart that both of her offspring had been in mortal danger, which had propelled her motherly devotion to new heights. Surprisingly, she had taken the postponement of the banns well. The reasoning, That the new Duke was far too consumed by grief over the deaths of his father and sister was beyond reproach. However, that did not stop her from treating Brynn as if she were made of eggshells, about to crack at the slightest pressure. As such, Brynn's health had been the subject for most of the dinner conversation, despite Grey's Herculean efforts to steer it elsewhere. Brynn swallowed her sigh of exasperation at her mother's suddenly acute stare. On cue, Lady Dinsmore's eyes narrowed. "You look quite pale, dear. Are you about to have a spell?" Brynn stifled a sigh, along with the tart response that she was weary only from all the smothering. "Mamma, for the 1,000th time, I am fine. My lungs are fine. I am not sick or in any immediate danger of becoming sick. I am pale because I have not been outside in days, and that is because you are convinced I will collapse at the slightest puff of wind." Her veiled sarcasm was entirely lost on the Countess, however. Lady Dinsmore tut-tutted. No, there's a distinct quiver in your voice. You need to get some rest." She signalled to one of the hovering footmen. "Summon her maid at once. Lady Briannon wishes to retire." She felt her face grow hot, and an irrepressible need to be taken for her word, to be trusted and undisputed, drove her to her feet. "I do not," Brynn snapped. "Enough, Mamma, please." She gentled her voice, seeing her mother's displeasure and forestalling the forthcoming explosion. "I love you, but I am not a child who needs to be put to bed. I am a grown woman, and I need a reprieve from this constant mothering. I am going out." "The hour is late, Briannon," Lady Dinsmore gasped and turned to her husband. "Herbert, do something. She'll catch her death." As her father grappled for a reply, dabbing a napkin at the corners of his mouth in order to stall for time, Brynn walked around the table and leaned down to press a kiss to her mother's furrowed brow. "No, Mamma, the fresh evening breeze will do me a world of good. Trust me." She smiled at her father and brother, who were both staring at her with identical expressions of astonishment as they too stood. "Papa, Grey, please excuse me. I need some air." "Bravo," Grey mouthed to her, his hands mimicking a clap as she swept past him. Leaning against the panelled wall of the outer room, Brynn closed her eyes and took in a slow breath, pressing her palms to her trembling middle. Inside the dining room, she could hear her father attempting to pacify her aggrieved mother, but Brynn didn't care to intervene, or apologize. She'd shot a marauder, endured a kidnapping, and escaped a killer, all without collapsing. If she'd learned anything at all from recent weeks, it was that she, and her lungs, were more than capable of weathering anything. That included the tempest in a teapot that was Lady Dinsmore. Grey's soft voice at her ear made her jump. "Well done." "Is Mamma very upset?" "She'll survive," he responded dryly, taking her arm and escorting her down the carpeted hallway. "I am proud of you, sister." "For what?" "For fighting for yourself." Brynn stared up at her brother, her frazzled emotions breaking free of her tenuous hold on them. Her hands shook as she clutched her skirts. Grey was wrong. She hadn't fought for a damned thing, not even when Archer had cancelled the bans, when he too had decided what was best for her. "No," she whispered. "I've done nothing." Grey stopped at the bottom of the staircase and drew around her to face him. "Why would you say that?" He held her stare, seeing past an excuse she was searching for and failing to find. "Is it because of Hawke's announcement?" Brynn flushed at the thought of the man who was no longer her betrothed. She had guessed that Archer would make an announcement in the Times, but she hadn't expected how much it would hurt. There was nothing between them any longer, nothing left to hold them together now that the impostor had been found. She hadn't seen him since Eloise's funeral, although he had called upon them briefly before the service. His manner had been distant and preoccupied, which was to be expected, and Brynn had given him the space to grieve. Despite his sister's ultimate treachery, she knew Archer mourned the loss. Now that his name was cleared and the true killer known, Archer was free to live his life, and she hers. She only wished the idea didn't make her so miserable. "You are better off without him," Grey said, seeing her expression. "No, I'm not." Overwhelmed by despair, Brynn's voice broke. "You don't know him like I do. No one does. I'm better when I'm with him. I don't feel weak or useless, and at least he doesn't treat me like a fragile porcelain doll." "You're not useless," Grey replied. "It's normal to come to care for someone after sharing a traumatic experience." "It's more than that, Grey," she said quietly. His grip tightened on her arms and then relaxed. "You're too—" "Too what?" she interrupted. "Too young to love, too sick to live, too weak to hope for normal things." Her laugh was empty. "Surely you, of all people, don't intend to patronize me as Mamma does. I know my own mind and the truth of what I feel." His mouth opened and closed, and then, to her surprise, he pulled her close. "You're right. I am sorry for suggesting otherwise. You'll find love again, Brynn, and if you don't, well, rest assured that you can always age into spinsterhood with your interminable bachelor of a brother." Ignoring the sharp twinge his words elicited, Brynn laughed into his neckcloth. "Not if Mamma has her way." Grey groaned, lashing his arms about her and kissing the crown of her head. Brynn couldn't help teasing him more. "Soon she will renew all her efforts to find you a suitable wife, which means I will finally be left in peace." "Heaven help me." Grey released her and clasped his hand to his chest with an aghast look. "A hellish torture, but one I will gladly endure, if only for you. You truly are the best brother." Squeezing Grey's arm with the first real smile she'd had in days, she climbed the stairs to her room where her lady's maid, Lana, was waiting. "I'm going out for a ride," Brynn announced. It would clear her head and ease her bruised heart, she hoped. "A storm is coming," Lana said as she selected a riding habit for her mistress. "Are you sure you want to go out?" Brynn stood at her window, trailing her fingers along the edge of the cool glass. She pushed a smile to her lips, despite the hollow ache that rested like a stone in her middle. Brynn studied the band of thunderclouds and sighed. She'd faced worse storms and knew that this one, too, would pass. "Of course. It's a beautiful evening. Those clouds will fade, you'll see." "It's good to be back, isn't it, my lady?" Brynn turned, hearing an odd note in Lana's voice. "You didn't enjoy being in London for the season?" Lana shook her head. "It's too busy, too many people. I prefer the solitude and the quiet of the country." "But didn't you live in the city while you were in Russia?" "We spent the winters there," Lana said, nostalgia flashing in her eyes for a moment. "My mother was very busy during those months. With the dressmaking, I mean," she added hastily. "But the rest of the time we spent in the country." Brynn shook her head. "You're like Grey, then. My parents usually have to threaten him to attend social events. Homebodies, the two of you." Lana didn't respond as she helped Brynn take off the gown she had been wearing. "I do love being back," Brynn continued with a wistful smile. "I will miss the balls and the parties, though. I would have enjoyed the spectacle of so many ladies being whisked off their feet by their gallant suitors." "Like you were?" Lana asked. She forced a cheerful note into her voice. "Come now, Lana, you and I both know that was a farce, which is thankfully over. It's official now." "Is it?" Brynn smiled, pretending to be distracted. "Is it what? Official? See for yourself. It's in the papers on the mantel." "No. Is it truly over with the Duke?" As if she were standing on the edge of a precipice that had suddenly given way to the abyss below, Brynn felt her stomach plunge. Trust Lana to ask such a blunt, astute question. Her hands fluttered as she tried to steady herself, drawing a sharp breath into her constricted lungs. It was over. It had to be over. Archer had never wanted marriage in the first place. He had called her his love in the Mews, and she had thought of that whispered word time and again the last few weeks. But Brynn knew he'd only been overwrought. He didn't love her, and what she felt for him was her burden alone. She shrugged and forced a smile, even though she knew Lana would see right through it. "I expect so. We concocted the engagement, after all. His Grace does not wish to marry." "I saw the way he looked at you at Lady Eloise's funeral," Lana said, "and it was not that of a man who wished to escape an unfortunate betrothal. He did not look at me once. He'd been thinking of other more important things, to be sure. He could barely take his eyes off you." Brynn quashed the bloom of hope that unfurled in her chest. "You are an incurable romantic, Lana. I assure you his grace has no further interest in me." "If my lady insists." Lana shook her head, opening her mouth as if she had more to say. She clamped her lips together, but then turned around, her eyes flashing. "You English are so blind. When something is right in front of you, you cannot see it, even with your eyes wide open. How can you not see that you and the Duke are perfectly suited to each other? In my country, if a man wants to court a woman, he does not give up until she is in his arms. And you know this from your vast experience with men," Brynn said dryly, but not unkindly. She and Lana were close enough in age for her to know that Lana was as sheltered as she. "No, it is because I have two perfectly good eyes." Brynn grinned at Lana's unexpected display of temper and threw her hands into the air in surrender. Sensing that she wouldn't convince Lana otherwise of Archer's intentions, she changed the subject. "I haven't gotten a chance to thank you properly, by the way, for what you did at the Mews. You saved my life, and the Duke's." She paused, clearing her throat. "You were right to confide in Grey. It was a stroke of luck that brought you to Hadley Gardens." Brynn shot her maid a circumspect look. "Though I can't imagine telling him was easy, given his temper. He was furious with me for hours afterward. Was he very angry?" "No, my lady," Lana said, the animation disappearing from her face as she busied herself with removing Brynn's stays and securing her hair into a single braid. "Lord Northridge seemed more concerned with your safety. And it wasn't luck. I've never seen him so deadly focused on anything. Once I told him of your plans with the Duke, he was intent on pursuing every possible path. Hadley Gardens was simply the first. He would have left no stone unturned to find you." Lana's voice was soft, holding a strange, warm tone as her fingers finished their task, tucking in the last of the combs. "He was splendid, wasn't he?" Brynn murmured as Lana fussed with her hair. "I thought it was over, and then he showed up like a knight in shining armor. I've never been more pleased to see my brother in all my life." "Lord Northridge does have his moments." Brynn glanced up at the odd tone of pride in Lana's voice, but couldn't see her face from where she stood braiding her hair. "There, that should hold," she said, watching as Brynn then donned Grey's old breeches and one of his old shirts. "Shall I put this riding habit away?" she asked with a resigned look. She knew better than to argue with her mistress's choice of dress. Brynn grinned at her wry expression. "You know I like to be comfortable." She pulled on her riding boots and secured a lightweight wool cloak over her shoulders. She paused at the door. "Thank you, Lana," she said quietly. "You are welcome, my lady. I did try my best to secure the braid, but it really is too slippery for the combs. No, not for my hair. For everything. For keeping my secrets and going beyond the boundaries of what would be expected of a lady's maid. I hope you know that I consider you a friend, and you may ask me for anything, should you need it." Something indescribable shone in Lana's eyes, but was quickly hidden as a smile shaped her mouth. She fell into a curtsy. "The feeling is quite mutual, my lady. Now go enjoy your ride, before the thunderstorm makes an unwelcome appearance." Brynn shook her head, pointing to the near-perfect sky beyond the window. "You are surely imagining things." But as Brynn raced Apollo across Ferndale's expansive grounds, she realized that Lana's premonition might come true after all. The clouds were rolling in, thick and dark and ominous. She wasn't worried, though. She'd have more than enough time to return to the stables before it started raining. She stretched forward, her hair long since fallen loose from the braid and its clips, and nudged the stallion into a canter. After a while she gave Apollo his head and sank low in the saddle, holding fast with her legs. Grinning with delight, she hung over his neck as he soared over the low hedges bordering Archer's property. She knew Archer wouldn't mind. A smile touched her lips as they neared the river, remembering how imperious she had been when she had warned him of trespassing. Now she was guilty of doing the same. It seemed like a lifetime had passed since the ball, a lifetime of stolen moments and false promises, a lifetime of lies. She slowed the horse, leading him to the river's edge where the embankment flattened, and dismounted. She hadn't been alone since Eloise's death. Hadn't truly wanted to be. She feared the silence and the freedom to think about what had happened that night in the mews. Only she, Archer, Grey, and Lana knew the truth, and they had done their best to preserve Eloise's memory. It all still felt like a nightmare to Brynn. That Eloise, so sweet and friendly and composed, could have been capable of such calculating and cold hatred for so many years was incomprehensible. Then again, love was such a capricious thing. It could lift one to the highest of highs and drag one to the lowest of lows. She stood there, wrapping her arms around her middle, and did the very thing she hadn't allowed herself to do yet. She let the tears come. The slight rustle of the grass alerted her to someone else's arrival. That, and a sudden deep throb of her heart. It was as if it had recognized him long before she had. "Lady Briannon," Archer said softly. She quickly wiped her cheeks on her sleeve. "So formal, Your Grace." "May I join you?" "I believe you may do whatever you wish," she said, smiling through the remnants of her tears, her heart trembling in her chest. It was extraordinary how the mere brush of his voice had come to affect her so. "It is your property, after all." "I do not want to intrude." Brynn turned then, letting her eyes feast on him as he stood beside his horse. He looked tired and heartbreakingly beautiful. She wanted nothing more than to throw herself into his arms, but Brynn kept herself perfectly still. "How are you?" she asked instead. He frowned and glanced away. "As well as can be expected." "And Brant?" "He is recovering." Archer hesitated before taking the few steps to stand at her side. He clasped his hands behind his back, and she held hers in a death grip. Every part of her body strained toward him, the draw to him magnetic. "He says to convey his gratitude, by the way. He is indebted to you." It was nothing. After a few moments of silence, he lifted his eyes to hers. "Brynn—" The first clap of thunder rumbled overhead, silencing him. He brushed a hand through his hair, as if fighting to find the words, and the tortured look in his eyes made everything inside her crumble. She swallowed and raised a trembling palm to stop him. "I saw the notice in the Times." He frowned again, but before he could speak she leaped to continue. "If you intend to apologize, please. There is no need. I'm only glad things worked out in our favor. Didn't we agree that it would be a ghastly union?" Brynn asked, attempting to smile. Her trembling chin wouldn't support it. "And I know you never wanted to be saddled with a wife." Her voice broke as the words tumbled out, leaving her empty and aching, but she'd had to say them. Before he did, at any rate. She still had some measure of pride left, and she wouldn't let him strip it from her. Archer cleared his throat, his gaze sliding across to her. "You're right, I didn't. After what my father did to my mother and to Eloise's mother, I thought I would be just like him. The apple not falling far from the tree and all that." She bit the inside of her cheek to steady her quivering lips. "He didn't truly believe that, did he?" "You are nothing like him," Brynn replied fiercely. "Nothing." Archer relented with a small grin. "I realized the same not too long ago. In part, I have you to thank for that." The gruff and sensual timbre of his voice made her pulse scatter. She could sense him looking at her, and felt herself crumbling beneath his gaze. Her battered heart could take only so much, and seeing him now, being with him, sheer will alone was holding her together. "Be strong," Brynn reminded herself. "You have to let him go. It's what he wants." But heaven help her, all she wanted was to hurl herself at him. "I'm glad," she blurted out. "You are a far better man than any father could have hoped for. I'm so very sorry about Eloise, but your name has been cleared, and you can finally put this mess behind you. You can move on with your life." "Brynn, and you needn't worry about me," she continued, ignoring the weight of his searching gaze. "In time the gossip will die down, and people will replace it with the next new scandal that comes along. I will be fine." "Brynn!" Archer turned her firmly to face him, but she stared determinedly at his shirt front. "I don't want you to be fine." You don't?" He shook his head, and she frowned, looking up at him. "I want you to be happy, deliriously happy," he said. and I want the chance to be the man who makes you so." Another rumble of thunder cut into his reply. Surely she hadn't heard him correctly. His words didn't make sense. "But you called off the betrothal. You don't want me. You think I don't want you?" A strangled sound erupted from his mouth. He grasped her shoulders, his eyes dark. "Are you mad? You are the only thing I think about. All day, all night, especially at night. I can't get you out of my head. I put that notice in the Times because it turns out I am a coward." "You're not," she whispered, her heart threatening to erupt from her chest. "You're the most courageous person I know. You save sick orphans and widows and bring hope to the hopeless." She smiled through the rush of emotion threatening to choke her. "Though I do question your methods, it's clear your heart is in the right place." Archer's thumb grazed her chin as if he were touching something infinitely precious. "I'm not worthy of you, Brynn, but I want so much to be. With an inarticulate groan, his mouth swooped down on hers as the first drops of rain fell. She gasped at the sweet urgency of his kiss. It reached deep into the very center of her body, Archer's hunger sudden and fierce, matching hers breath for breath. Unwilling to leave a sliver of space between them, he fitted her body to his hand rounding her buttocks and pressing his thighs flush against hers. The possessive touch was her undoing. Brynn moaned and clung to him, winding her fingers in his coat, unwilling to let him part from her. She arched against him, her hands climbing up around his neck to draw him closer. She couldn't hold a single thought in her head as his mouth pushed harder against hers, his tongue claiming hers with desperate need. They stood there, devouring each other, as the rain drenched their bodies and lightning cleaved the sky. Apollo reared up wildly as a peal of thunder shook the earth. The sudden motion drove her and Archer apart, Brynn managing to grab Apollo's reins before he spooked, and Archer doing the same with his horse. Water ran into his face and down his body, making the shirt beneath the open panels of his jacket stick to the muscled planes of his chest. Even in the rapidly falling darkness, the sight of him, illuminated by a streak of lightning, made Brynn quiver with want. Archer stared at her in a similar fashion, his eyes consuming her as greedily as hers devoured him. She gathered her breath, realizing the thin white shirt she wore wouldn't offer much in the way of coverage. Her body burned at Archer's ravenous gaze. There were two choices open to them. He could go back to Worthington Abbey and she to Ferndale, or she could throw away every shred of decorum she had left and give in to the demands of her body and her heart. She wanted him. She'd wanted him for so long, even before their encounter at Bishop House, when his hands and fingers had touched her to her soul. Brynn's chest heaved with the force of the storm brewing inside of her. It surpassed the very real one howling about them. It was a storm only Archer could appease. Brynn closed her eyes and exhaled. She climbed astride Apollo. "Follow me. My cottage. It's not far." Chapter 25. Archer stoked the fire while Brynn changed behind a screen. He had tied the horses into the attached stall on the far side of the cottage, stocked with fresh hay and water for her horses' use. Apollo didn't seem to mind sharing his bed with a stranger. The flames lent the inside of the cottage a warm, welcoming glow. He hadn't been inside before, but everything about it felt like her. The cottage itself comprised a single room, dominated by a bed on one end and the vestibule on the other. Books were crammed onto the bookshelves along one wall, and whimsical paintings graced the others. A tiny wooden table and a single armchair stood in one snug corner. He shrugged out of his wet jacket, but kept the rest of his clothes on. Despite her suggestion of using the cottage to weather the storm, Archer didn't want to make any assumptions. He wouldn't touch her unless she invited him to, because one touch, one taste, and it would be over. He wouldn't be able to resist her, and he knew she, too, would give herself to him. Archer didn't want her to make that decision in the heat of the moment, when her mind and her heart were in tumult. If Brynn wanted him the way he did her, He wanted nothing but a sober, self-possessed permission. "There should be water in the kettle," Brynn said, emerging from behind the screen. "For some tea." She had changed into a simple linen shift, a heavy blanket pulled around her shoulders. The sight of her made his breath catch. Like a barefoot duchess, she was fresh and innocent and completely beguiling. She joined him by the fire and combed her fingers through her damp hair. Catching the light, the wet strands gleamed like flame in her hands. Resisting the urge to gather her in his arms and bury his face in her hair, he did as she asked instead, boiling the water for tea while she sat upon a stool before the fire. "Are you well? How are your lungs?" he asked, handing her a steaming mug. He remembered her draped in his arms, unconscious at the engagement ball, and a frisson of worry shot through him. "The chill won't take if I am warm and dry." Archer took another stool and moved to sit behind her. Her eyes flared at his nearness, but he did nothing more than run his fingers through the silky, burnished, coppery gold waves, holding them out toward the warmth of the fire. "What are you doing?" she asked. He smiled. "Drying your hair. You don't have to. I want to." They sat in silence, the heat from the fire spreading quickly throughout the small room, and soon Brynn's hair was dry and soft, falling through his fingers like liquid flame. The sensual feel of it set his body on edge. He wanted to see that glorious hair spilling over her naked shoulders, feel it falling onto his chest as he brought her to the verge and back again. But first, he needed to clear the air. "Brynn," he began again, "I want to finish what I started to say earlier. What you did for me, no one has ever done anything like that. You put your life on the line to save mine, and to save my friend, with no concern for your own safety. I can never repay you for what you have done." "You don't have to," she said quickly. He swallowed and nodded. "You were right when you said that I never intended to marry." The wounded expression on her face had him rushing to continue. "I didn't think I could be happy, and I didn't want the burden of making someone else happy, especially when I saw what that had done to my mother. Until you stormed into my perfectly ordered life, wearing naught but a pair of men's breeches, I don't think I knew what true living was. I don't think I even knew what true happiness was." Archer sat forward on the stool, her hair still twined between his fingers. "I know only that when I am not with you, I am desolate. I know that I want to do everything within my power to make you smile and laugh, to make you come alive in my arms. I cannot imagine a second in my life without you in it." It was the truth, raw and honest. Every word spoken lifted a weight from his soul, until he felt lighter than he had for as long as he could recall. Brynn drew a shaking breath. "What are you saying?" "I went to Ferndale. Your lady's maid told me that you had gone for a ride." "You came to find me?" she asked in an aching voice. "Yes," he said, "and to return these." Releasing her silky hair, Archer reached into his trouser pocket. Her eyes sparkled with tears as his hand appeared again, her grandmother's pearl necklace and matching earbobs filling his palm. "You didn't sell them," she whispered. "No, and I realized why only a few days ago. I wanted to keep something that you loved close to me. It was a poor substitute, but my wretched heart couldn't bear to part with them. I wanted your love, you see." "My love," she repeated, her gaze sealing itself to his. "Yes, haven't you been listening to a word I've been saying?" he teased. "You want my love?" She stared at him, her lower lip trembling. "Of course I do. What do you think this is all about?" "But I assumed you felt obligated." He smiled at her. "No, darling. The only obligation I feel is to love you unconditionally for every last day of my life." His hands rose to her cheeks, cradling them between his palms as he memorized every beloved curve of her face. "And in return, if you give me your love, your anger, your joy, your passion, your hope, your dreams, or any little thing you choose, I would be eternally grateful." Archer reached for her trembling hands, still clutching her pearls, and pressed his lips to her wrist. His heart nearly burst with the need to make her his in every single way. But he wanted her answer first, her unclouded acceptance. Marry me, for real this time. His fingers brushed away the single tear tracing down the apple of her cheek, his voice catching on his next words. I am madly and foolishly and unquestionably in love with you, Lady Briannon, and if you don't put me out of my misery by giving me an answer, Yes, yes! Brynn pressed a finger to his lips with a tremulous smile, her eyes shining with the force of her emotion. Will you please kiss me now? He groaned as he drew her into his lap and crushed her to him. He kissed her eyes, the slope of her cheek, her nose, before searching for the softness of her mouth. His bride-to-be parted her lips sweetly, offering herself to him completely. This kiss was the opposite of the one by the river, full of promise and love, but no less consuming. This time Archer held no part of himself back. This brave and courageous woman in his arms was his sole reason for living, and he wanted her to know it as firmly as he did. She set her pearls on her abandoned stool and turned her hands to his chest, unbuttoning the first button there, and then the second. His breath grew shallow as her fingers brushed lower, freeing the next three in quick succession. Brynn, he groaned, at the trail of heat her fingers left behind. What are you doing? She smiled, mischief glinting in her eyes as she pushed the material off his shoulders. We are engaged, are we not? She said wickedly, repeating his words from the library in Hadley Gardens. Her palm grazed the naked skin of his chest, flicking past the ridged muscles of his stomach. He stopped its descent with one of his hands, his breathing harsh. I want you so desperately, I cannot trust myself to stop, he rasped. I don't want you to stop. Archer stared into her eyes, the colour of clover and warm honey. The world tilted beneath his feet at the explicit invitation in them, the invitation he'd craved, the one he'd waited for an eternity it seemed. His hand curled into the lustrous silk of her hair as hers wound around his neck. He lifted her easily and crossed the room to the bed. The blanket over her shoulders fell away, leaving her in only her thin linen shift. Her dusky areolas pushed against the cloth, already hard and hunting for his touch. Brynn flushed at his hot stare, but Archer wanted her to feel no shame in her body's response to him. He wanted to suckle her and make her moan. He wanted to put his mouth on every inch of her body, just as he'd confessed in her study at Bishop House. He set her down slowly at the side of the bed, inching her body along his until her toes touched the floor. His arms curved around her to release the string tie at the neck of her shift. The linen fell in a pool around her ankles. Without breaking contact, he lifted her and placed her on the bed. Clad only in sheer drawers, she made no attempt to cover herself from him, even though she blushed furiously as his eyes swept her from top to bottom, devouring every sublime inch of her body. God, you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, he murmured, watching as the firelight played across her rosy skin. She looked doubtful at the compliment, but Archer meant every word, and he grew determined to prove it. He had never seen anyone more perfectly formed. She looked like a wanton sprite with her hair fanning over the pillow. His sprite. Her breasts, fully bared to him, were as flawless as he remembered, even more perfect than his fevered memories. All the curves and hollows of her body were his to adore. Her long, shapely legs and the soft hourglass contours of her stomach tantalized and fascinated him. He wanted to make her writhe from his touch as she had in her study, see her eyes go dark with passion, feel her body convulse around him, bring her to blissful oblivion again and again. Archer shrugged out of his shirt and shed his breeches, standing before her in nothing but his smalls. He didn't want to alarm her, and the sight of his erection, already stirring underneath his linen drawers, could very well do just that. But a slow, secretive smile crept over her lips, and Brynn clapped her hands to her face, smothering a giggle. "Does something amuse you?" he asked, crossing his arms and waiting for her answer by the side of the bed. "I have a confession to make," she replied, biting back another grin, this one accompanied by her hands covering her face. "And I fear it may affect your Her anxious gaze peeked through her fingers. Mood? Archer had no idea what her confession could be, or why she would choose now of all times to part with it. He was swollen and stiff, and these smalls needed to come off. Brynn, my love, he growled. Unless it is a matter of life and death, I forgive you. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, and the tantalizing sway of her breasts distracted him wholly as she reached for his leg. Archer remained still, the pad of her finger grazing the healed, shallow gunshot wound on his thigh. It's nothing, he said, dismissing the reddish-pink scar tissue. She glanced up at him, her finger still stroking his thigh, making his body tighten with excitement. It wasn't nothing. You were shot. You've been reading your father's news sheets again, he muttered, recalling once more the article on Lady Amelia and her report that the bandit had been shot. She shook her head. I didn't read them. He peered down at her. Then how do you know? Because I'm the one who shot you. His arms swung loose at his sides, and he caught her hand. You? He dragged up the murky recollection of the mysterious boy while staring at Brynn. Of course he'd considered the possibility, but at that time she hadn't known the bandit's identity. He'd figured the Brynn he knew would have taken better aim, and then dragged his corpse off his mount and searched his pockets for her grandmother's pearls. Yes, I'm sorry, but I couldn't allow you to rob Lady Amelia or her chaperone, and I was still furious with the marauder for robbing me. She paused with a wry shrug. I didn't intend to kill you, just scare you a little. You shot me. Brynn smiled again, clearly amused, as her fingers continued their exploration up his thigh. In my defense, I did not know it was you at the time. Would it have made a difference? He asked, the soft, titillating touches driving him to bloody distraction. Perhaps. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his scar. Her eyes rose to meet his, but they were waylaid by the telling bulge of his smalls. Archer dimly recalled how the boy had shied away from removing his trousers. Why, Lady Briannon, how naughty of you, he teased, loving the deep rose colouring of her cheeks. Had I known it was you there in that cottage, I would have acted far differently. What would you have done? She replied in a breathy tone as he pulled her upward. He fitted her body against his and watched her eyes widen at the indelicate press of his hardened length. Why, I would have demanded you do the honourable thing and marry me at once. He gave an exaggerated flutter of his eyelashes, imitating an artful coquette. Think of my reputation. You lured me into a deserted cottage, manhandled my person. I could have been ruined. Brynn burst into laughter and threw a pillow at him. You are a complete charlatan. Tugging her back into his arms, he kissed her, and when they broke apart, she pressed her fingers to his lips. Although I am sorry for hurting you. He grinned wickedly. I know a way you can make it up to me. Taking her with him, he climbed into bed, the mattress sinking beneath their combined weight as he drew the sheet over them. He discarded the last of his clothing, and in a blink, the humour vanished from her face, replaced with apprehension. Don't be afraid, love. I'm not, but I don't know what to do, she blurted out, and then squeezed her eyes shut with embarrassment. Trust me, he said. Anything you do, I will like. Brynn peered at him through her lashes. What if you don't? Do you like it when I touch you? He asked. She nodded, her bottom lip pinned between her teeth. Then you can trust that it will be the same for me. He took her hand and placed it against his thudding heart. Even the mere thought of touching you makes my heart race. It makes mine race too, she admitted. Tentatively, Brynn ran a hand over his shoulder, the flat of her palm skimming down over his nipple and making a surge of raw pleasure spear through him. Do you like this? His body clenched with desire. The woman had no idea what she did to him. Yes. And this? She leaned over to seal her mouth to his, dragging her teeth across his lower lip. He felt the sleek push of her tongue, and tightened his hands in the sheets, forcing himself to remain still for every moment of her exploration. Her mouth traced a hot path to his ear where she nibbled his lobe, her hands skipping past his ribs to his abdomen, His entire body was on fire at her inexperienced, hesitant caresses. Her fingertips reached lower, brushing against his hips, and Archer couldn't wait any longer. "My turn," he growled. He settled his lips to her mouth, his hand sliding along the side of her breast until she arched against him. He kissed her slowly at first, and then with more fervour as her hands came between them to clasp his shoulders. He trailed kisses down her throat, her tiny moans exciting him even more than they had before. Finally he set his lips to her breast, teasing the peak with his tongue before drawing it into his mouth. "So incredibly sweet," he said, "so perfect. This woman is going to be my wife. This proud, beautiful, irresistible woman." And Archer loved her. Awash in sensation, Brynn succumbed to Archer's skillful caresses. Her fingers twined in his hair as he paid homage to her other breast before returning to her lips. He knew exactly how to make her burn for him. His kisses made sharp streaks of pleasure spiral through her as his tongue stroked hers, and his hands flicked down her sides to the waistband of her drawers. His knuckles brushed against the velvety skin of her stomach to slip beneath the thin material. Brynn gasped at the intimate shift of his hands, and a knowing smile touched his lips. "I've thought of nothing else since, too," he told her. "The way you felt against me, the sweet, unhinged response of your body. I want to see you come apart again." Her body thrummed an erratic cadence, his seductive words making her weak. Archer kissed her swiftly and began to work his way down her body, his tongue running between her breasts and delving into the sensitive indent of her navel. His hands slid her drawers past her hips, and in one smooth motion he removed the last piece of her clothing. She lay naked before him, every part of her on display for him to view and appraise. Heat singed her body in a deep blush. Embarrassed, she reached for the sheet, but Archer stalled the movement. "No, don't. Do you have any idea how beautiful you are? Your ankles, your calves, your knees, your hips, all of you. I could stare at you forever." Brynn inhaled sharply, seduced by his fevered words, as his fingers caressed the slope of her knee and the curve of her thigh. His mouth and tongue followed the searing path of his hands, his lips tracing the sharp edges of her hip bones. Every touch, every scrape of his teeth made her skin tingle and burn. Her body felt as if it were melting, transforming from flesh and bone to liquid heat as Archer's hand settled onto the ready, damp core of her. Oh! Her hips lanced forward, craving more. Archer circled his finger there with slow, deliberate strokes, her body tightening compulsively at the scorching sensations his touch evoked. His lips grazed across the plane of her belly, closer to the heat of her. She gasped his name as she realized where his mouth was going, what it sought. "Archer, no." I like the word yes more. His lips followed the hot path of his fingers, and when he finally set his mouth to her core, Brynn's head fell back with a cry of surprise. The glide of his tongue against her was as electrifying as the storm outside. Brynn almost lost herself in the wild, carnal sensation of it as Archer eased his tongue deeper, licking and thrusting, and doing lewd, wicked things that she had never dreamed of. But, oh, sweet Lord, she didn't want him to stop. Archer settled himself between her thighs and swirled his tongue against her in teasing, flicking motions that drove her daft, his fingers working gently into her passage, stroking forward and retreating. In a mindless daze, her fingers tangled in his hair, and she moaned his name. The exquisite pleasure was unbearable, searing. Brynn writhed against his mouth, incoherent sounds escaping her lips. Her body felt possessed, utterly consumed by him, and as he drew her pliant flesh between his teeth, it froze for one terrifyingly bright second, and then shuddered into wild tremors that threatened to break her apart. "I love the way you taste," he whispered. His erotic words made her quiver anew at the thought of what he'd just done, and how wantonly she'd responded. With a satisfied smirk, Archer nuzzled her stomach and worked his way back up her body, continuing to stroke her with his hand, sliding it around her hip to hold her flush against him. He caressed the length of her spine, curving around her buttocks and gently moulding her flesh. He held her gaze, as if needing to measure every moment, every reaction to his touch. Brynn swallowed hard at the pressure of his arousal pressing so intimately into her, but she didn't pull away as Archer positioned himself at the entrance of her body. He inched forward, the strain of holding back bunching his muscles as her virginal passage stretched to accommodate him. The insistent press of his blunt tip felt like his fingers had, only much, much larger. Her hands found his shoulders, kneading apprehensively. "Archer! Trust me, darling." He pushed as far forward as he could until Brynn felt as if she were going to split apart. He stroked her face, all the love in the world glowing in his eyes. She knew that he would never hurt her, not when he looked at her like that with so much aching tenderness. "I love you, Briannon." The gently offered words were her undoing. "And I you." He entered her fully then, and her body arched like a bow against him, a sharp cry wrenching from her mouth. A hot lash of pain tore through her, echoing in waves across her lower abdomen. It felt like she had been split apart, her body rebelling against the unfamiliar girth of him. Her eyes smarted as she expelled a shuddering breath. Archer held himself still, his face above her strained and worried. "Brynn? I'm okay," she assured him, and it wasn't a lie for very long. The pain flattened out until there was only the proud heat of him resting deep within her. "Are you certain?" Brynn answered by reaching for his mouth with hers, her tongue curling against his in desperate need. She needed him. Archer shifted slightly, and she braced for another bout of pain as he withdrew. Groaning, he sank carefully back into her clinging heat, but this time there was no pain, just the unfathomable, astonishing slide of his body joining with hers. She gasped at the pressure, and within moments her body let go, softening underneath him, receiving him as it was meant to do. Brynn's hands settled around his waist as he moved, slowly at first and then with more intensity, as she clutched at him, her hips rocking instinctively upward to meet his deep, controlled thrusts. Pleasure pulsed through her thighs with every stroke. Instinct took over as she matched his motions, hitching her legs around him as he had taught her and gasping at the deepened friction. Archer growled as if pleased, his movements quickening with the deliberate shift of her hips. "Archer," she moaned. "Soon, my love," Archer said, sliding his hand in between their slick bodies and amplifying the tension to impossible heights. His thumb stroked her sensitive bud as his body drove rhythmically into hers. The erotic combination made her senseless. She murmured inaudibly, gripping him with her thighs to bring him closer, to make him more a part of her than he already was. Her nails dug into his back, and Archer responded to her demands, driving deeper, giving her what she asked for. Brynn matched his hungry rhythm, wanting to please him as much as he wanted to please her. She was reaching for something, but she didn't know what. Deep down she knew that Archer would give it to her. But she frowned as he slowed his pace, the effort making him grunt as he hoisted his weight to his forearms. "Am I going too fast?" he asked. "Your lungs, I don't want to push you too hard." He was worried about her lungs now. "Archer," she gasped, half laughing, half growling. "My lungs will surely burst if you stop." She wrapped her legs around his waist, making him inhale sharply, and more than conveying what she wanted. He grinned at her boldness and twisted to his back, taking her with him until she was straddling his hips. Brynn cried out in surprise as he pressed intimately up into her and flushed hotly at the brazen position. "I've always been rather jealous of Apollo," he told her with a knowing wink. Brynn's legs went weak at the overtly erotic suggestion. Sitting astride Archer was nothing like riding her horse. She hovered over him, her hair a cascade around her shoulders until he pushed it back, allowing him free rein of her breasts once again. He rolled her nipples between his fingers, and she moaned low in her throat. "What do I do?" she gasped. He placed his hands on her hips, and with a gentle rocking motion showed her what he wanted. A smile curved her lips as she followed his instruction, her tentative thrusts soon turning frenzied. Brynn nearly stopped breathing with the sheer torture of it. "Please," Brynn whimpered, the pressure between her thighs agonizing. "Almost there," he grunted as his hips ground against hers with desperation. "Come with me, love." He reached between their bodies to stroke her, and she cried out, her body racked with spasms as he sent her barreling over the edge. Brynn sunk forward, and he held her close, groaning as the convulsions of her orgasm rippled around his length, still buried deep within her. With a growl of what she could only describe as pure male satisfaction, Archer surged upward in one powerful thrust, his body bucking beneath hers as he too found his release. Brynn felt sated to the center of her bones. Archer brought her gently back to the mattress beside him. He brushed the damp hair out of her face and frowned. "Darling, is something the matter?" She nodded solemnly, and his hesitant frown turned into something panicked. "What is it?" Brynn stared at the face of the man she loved, and felt everything in her world fall perfectly into place. She smoothed the furrows from his brow. "I'm afraid, Your Grace, that you have made good on your threat." "And which threat is that?" he said, his voice wary. Then she smiled at him, her entire heart lighting up with mischief and love and contentment. "I have been completely and utterly ruined." Epilogue. Brynn stared at her new husband of barely a month and hid a secret smile as she strolled through the verdant gardens of Worthington Abbey. He stood at the lily pond, one black Hessian propped on the pond's low stone perimeter, in deep conversation with the Earl of Thorndale. The two men were no doubt discussing the new children's hospices they had agreed to build together in London. Archer had retired the guise of the Masked Marauder for good, instead soliciting charitable donations to improve the situations of the sick and needy in London and in the countryside as well. When Archer had brought her to a handful of the churches, hospitals, and orphanages that the Masked Marauder's repurposed money had benefited, she had been stunned. It had made her and Archer more determined to make a difference. In a legal way, of course. And so Archer had founded the Bradburn Trust in memory of his mother, a charitable organization that fed and clothed starving children, provided medicine to the ill, and helped families caught in dire straits. She knew most of the ton viewed them and their efforts as eccentric, but she didn't care. She could hardly turn a blind eye to those who were suffering on their doorstep when she had so much and they so little. Brynn was deep in preparations for the Trust's first fundraising gala, one they planned to host every year in honor of Archer's mother, the late Lady Bradburn. It would be an evening of entertainment and dancing, and considering the frenzy of excitement surrounding the Duke and his new Duchess, not one member of the peerage would dare miss it. Brynn was inordinately proud of her husband and his burning desire to make the world a better place. He was still Robin Hood of the old ballads, but now he asked for funds instead of stealing them. Archer was escorting Lord Thorndale to a waiting coach after a lengthy morning meeting. The two were equal in height, though Lord Thorndale was lighter in colouring and far more mild-mannered and approachable than her husband. They did seem to get along well, however. Lady Thorndale had been in attendance at the wedding, and Brynn had taken a liking to her immediately. The wedding seemed like it had happened years ago instead of a few weeks. Archer had reposted the banns a short week before they had been married in Essex, in a discreet ceremony in the village church. Archer had asked her whether she wanted a London society wedding, but Brynn had declined, and despite her mother's obvious consternation, Brynn had stood her ground. She'd had enough attention to last her a lifetime. Their reception ball had been another matter altogether, as the marriage of a duke wasn't one to be ignored. Their friends and acquaintances had travelled in droves to Essex in the midst of the season to toast their nuptials, and the guest rooms at Worthington Abbey and Ferndale had been filled to bursting. It had been a full 3 days of dancing and celebration, with visitors toasting their happiness, all of them misty-eyed at the sight of the handsome, aloof Duke, smiling in enchanted delight at his young bride. The wedding had been everything she had imagined, and more. even when she said her vows and pledged to obey him, and Archer had promptly crooked an amused eyebrow. She'd stifled a shocked giggle and admonished him later outside the church. "You terrible wretch! Have to keep you on your toes now that you are to be my obedient wife," he'd teased. "No more midnight escapades attempting to lure dangerous criminals." His voice had lowered a notch. Unless, of course, it is in bed. Which would explain why her colour had been unnaturally high as they entered Archer's splendid ducal coach, enough to provoke a barrage of questions from her mamma, asking whether she was about to have a spell. That night, Archer had made love to her with a new exquisite tenderness. Only when he had brought her to the heights of pleasure for a third time had he allowed himself release. He had worshipped her with his body, letting her know then and forever that she would always, and only, be his. Brynn trembled at the memory, her body melting as it did when thoughts of him invaded her mind. Their days were shared with laughter and intelligent, provoking debates, and their nights with passionate love-making. He showed her all the ways a man could please a woman, and had taken exceptional satisfaction, she was certain, in showing her all the ways a woman could please a man. Some nights he made love to her swiftly, and others he took his time, drawing out each blissful second. A faint blush coloured her cheeks as she recalled earlier that morning, when she had woken him from slumber, rolling astride him and coaxing his body to life. He loved it when she took charge, and she enjoyed watching him lose himself beneath her. It was a part of him only she would ever know. That underneath his self-possessed and standoffish exterior there lay a passionate and deeply caring man. When Archer was with her, he had no need for masks or pretences. He was him, and she loved him with an intensity that she could hardly put into words. She couldn't seem to get enough of him, nor he of her. Which would explain why her monthly flux was late. Brynn wrapped her hands around her middle and smiled again. Her fingers spread across the flat expanse of her stomach at the thought of the tiny life blooming there. She and Archer had not yet discussed children, though she wanted them desperately. A part of her worried that his own difficult upbringing and his father's innumerable byblows would have made him resistant to the idea. She didn't want to ask, because, in truth, she feared the answer. She waved as Lord Thorndale's coach ambled past, and then caught the eye of her husband. He strode in her direction, his long legs crossing the distance in a few swift strides. He looked tantalizing in his trousers and linen shirt, his fingers undoing the topmost button of his collar, now that company had departed. He caught her to him and took her lips in a breathless kiss. "My lord," she gasped against them, even as her body responded the way it always did when he touched her. "The servants have been well paid to turn a blind eye to my wife's public displays of wantonness." "You shameless rogue," she said, blushing, though relishing the feel of his strong arms about her. "I do no such thing." He nuzzled her ear, breathing in the scent of her. "Then, my dear Duchess, you should stop looking so desirable. The sight of you can incite a man to madness." He glanced up at the clear blue sky, and smiled down at her before placing a chaste kiss to her cheek, one that was completely undermined by the leering look in his eye. "Do you fancy a ride before dinner?" "Not today." "Is something amiss?" he asked with a frown. "You never say no to taking Apollo out. Is it your health?" He had taken up Gray's vexing habit of worrying over her breathing once she'd moved to Worthington Abbey, though she found she could better endure it coming from Archer. She didn't enjoy that he worried, but the crease between his eyes whenever he did felt like a small reminder of how much she meant to him. Brynn was quite certain she'd never tire of seeing or hearing how much he loved her. "No, everything is fine. I feel like a stroll instead. Walk with me." With a concerned look, Archer did as she asked. They ambled through the gardens, the light scent of the flowers rising with the afternoon breeze. He stopped her at a bench out of sight of the house. "Something is in the wind. What is it? Was it the meeting this morning? I'm sorry it went so long, but the plans for the hospitals are taking longer than we expected." "No, it's not that," she said, drawing him down to sit on the bench with her. She drew a deep, calming breath, fighting the rapid cadence of her heart. "I held a baby some days ago at the orphanage, and I was wondering if you wanted children," she finished lamely. A shadow flickered over his eyes as he regarded her in sombre silence. "Someday, I mean," she added when his attention lowered to her hand, still splayed across her middle. "Is there something you wish to tell me?" he asked, gently nudging her chin up to face him. "I am past my time." "You are with child?" She nodded, even though his soft words hadn't been a question. Brynn nearly melted at the tender, awe-struck look in his eyes. "My child," he whispered in reverent wonder. She heard the joy in his hushed tone, saw the cresting light of another dawn in his eyes as they gazed at her stomach again. In that moment, all of Brynn's fears drained away. "If it's a boy," she said, teary-eyed and smiling, "we'll have to make sure he doesn't follow in his marauding father's footsteps." Archer took her into his arms, his fingers intertwining with hers, lying against her stomach. "But if it's a girl, I fear we will have much more to worry about, especially if she is anything like her mother." "And how is that?" Brynn asked. "To be beautiful, fearless, and incomparable is to invite great distress upon her father. He will surely have to lock her in a tower and post 3 guards at all times." Her breath hitched at the love on his face, and she slid a palm up to his cheek. "And what if she wears her brother's breeches and rides without a saddle and says what she thinks? Then I shall count myself the luckiest father in the world." Brynn opened her mouth to retort, but her husband leaned down and smothered her words with his lips. And then she forgot everything but him. This concludes My Rogue, My Ruin by Amalie Howard and Angie Morgan, narrated by Paul Woodson, a member of SAG-AFTRA. Copyright 2016 by Amalie Howard and Angie Fraser. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Entangled Publishing, care of Alliance Rights Agency LLC, and was produced in the year 2020 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.